Tonight, we're taking a slow step back into the 1600s, a time when fear and superstition ruled small villages, and being called a witch could change your life forever. This quiet journey will explore what it felt like to live under constant suspicion, how rumors turned into accusations, and what happened when fear took control of entire communities. So, before you get comfortable, subscribe to the channel and like the video and comment down below where are you watching from and at what time. Life in a 1600s village was shaped by a thick fog of fear and belief, a deep trust in things unseen and unexplained. People didn't just hope the weather would hold or that their cow would stop limping. They believed things happened because they were meant to happen, or because someone, or something, caused them. Maybe it was God's will. Maybe it was the devil's. Maybe it was that strange woman who lived near the woods and never looked anyone in the eye. Religion wasn't just a personal belief system. It was the core of everything. Nearly every person in a small European village in the 1600s lived with the church at the center of their world, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. The church bell told you when to wake, when to gather, when someone died. Sundays were sacred. Missing church without a good reason could raise questions about your soul. Priests and ministers were powerful voices. Their words were taken seriously, and if they warned against sin, against the presence of evil, people listened. Most villagers couldn't read. They learned through sermons, stories passed by word of mouth, and what they saw with their own eyes. There was little room for critical thinking. And in that gap, between what people saw and what they didn't understand, superstition took root. It was common to believe in spirits, omens, signs. A crow landing on a windowsill could be a warning. A sudden storm might be more than just weather. It might be a punishment. A child's unexplained fever could be the result of a curse. A cow that stopped giving milk might not just be sick, someone might have stolen its milk with magic. And it wasn't always about fear. Some people relied on charms and little rituals to protect themselves. A sprig of herbs hung above a door. A nail driven into a tree. A whispered rhyme at night. Magic, to them, wasn't just fantasy. It was real. Both good and bad magic had a place in the world. There were cunning folk who were known to heal with herbs, say blessings, and even tell fortunes. Some were respected. Some were feared. And all of them walked a thin line. People might turn to them in desperation, but if anything went wrong afterward, those same people could quickly become the accused. Fear of the unknown ruled over everything. There was no science the way we know it now. No concept of germs. No understanding of mental illness. No clear explanation for why one baby lived and another died. So people did what people do. They made meaning from the mess. They blamed what they didn't understand on what they feared. And that fear seeped into every corner of life. If a neighbor stared too long at your house, if your crops withered while theirs thrived, if someone muttered under their breath and then your child got sick, these things weren't coincidences. Not back then. People connected dots that may never have been meant to be connected. And once suspicion took root, it was nearly impossible to shake off. Villages were small, insular. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. You knew your neighbors. You watched them. You judged them. You remembered what they said years ago. Old grudges didn't disappear. They waited. And sometimes, they found their way into something much more dangerous. When food was scarce, when the rain didn't come, when an illness swept through without mercy, people wanted answers. They wanted someone to blame. And sometimes, that someone was already living among them. The idea of witches wasn't a distant myth. It was an ever-present possibility. And because it was so easy to believe, it was just as easy to accuse. It's hard now to fully imagine that world. To imagine waking up every day knowing that your neighbors might watch you for signs. That if you smiled too much, or not enough, if you helped a birth or witnessed a death, if your herbs healed someone or if they didn't, you could be next. That every glance, every whisper, every misstep might tip the balance. And in that world, all it took was a few words, a few suspicions, for life to change forever. In a small village during the 1600s, suspicion didn't need much to grow. A sideways glance, a strange habit, a poorly timed illness, anything even slightly unusual could start a whisper. And whispers had weight. They moved fast. They stuck to people. And more often than not, they stuck to women. Not just any women, though. There were patterns to it. Certain kinds of women lived closer to the edge of suspicion than others. Not because of anything they had done, really, but because of who they were, or more importantly, who they weren't. A widow, for instance. A woman whose husband had died, and who now lived alone. That in itself was enough to make people uneasy. A woman was expected to be under a man's roof, under a man's name. Her father. Her husband. Maybe her son, if she had one. But a woman alone, managing her own land, minding her own business, was unsettling to many. She didn't have a man to answer to. She didn't ask permission. She didn't follow the expected rhythm of life. And if she spoke her mind or simply didn't smile enough, people noticed. They wondered. They judged. Or take a healer. Not someone formally trained, that wasn't a thing in most villages, but someone who knew plants, who could ease pain, help with childbirth, soothe rashes, or mix salves from herbs gathered along the hedges. People came to her in need. They asked for help. But if the treatment didn't work, or if something else went wrong afterward, the healer's helpfulness could turn into a threat. Knowledge was a double-edged sword. A woman who knew too much was already suspect. If she knew about herbs, what else might she know? If she could cure, could she also curse? And then there were the quiet ones. The women who didn't take part in village gossip, who didn't attend church regularly, who didn't marry or have children, or who simply kept to themselves. Loneliness was seen as suspicious. Privacy was mistaken for secrecy. In a world where everyone's business was everyone's business, choosing to be alone made people uneasy. And uneasiness, especially during hard times, could curdle into fear. Illness was one of the most common sparks. When a child got sick suddenly, when someone died without warning, when a fever lingered for weeks, people needed to explain it. They didn't understand infections or viruses. They only saw cause and effect. Who visited the house last? Who looked at the child strangely the day before? Who had an argument with the mother? It didn't take much for a grieving parent to say, "She cursed my child." And once that idea was spoken aloud, it was hard to put it back in the shadows. Bad weather was another reason. If it rained too much or not enough, if hail ruined the crops, if livestock refused to breed or gave birth to stillborn young, nature itself became a judge. People didn't understand climate. They saw patterns where there were none. And often, they looked for a human cause behind natural events. A storm after an argument. A frost after a strange dream. The mind makes meaning, even where none exists. Especially when food is running low or when winter is cruel. Social tension played a part too. Villages weren't always peaceful. People borrowed things and didn't return them. Fences got built too far over boundary. Someone's chickens strayed into someone else's garden. Minor disputes festered. And sometimes, they needed an outlet. If someone was already disliked or already strange, those small grudges could build into something far worse. It didn't help that the idea of witches wasn't vague. It was detailed. Everyone had heard the stories. Witches flew at night. Witches made pacts with the devil. Witches cursed animals, spoiled milk, dried up wells. Everyone knew the signs: a black cat, a crooked back, a mark on the skin. And once you started looking for those signs, you could find them anywhere. A mole on the skin wasn't just a mole. A muttered word wasn't just frustration. A pot that boiled over wasn't just poor timing, it was suspicious. And if a woman had enemies, if she had outlived too many husbands, if she knew too much, or even just said too little, she could become a target. Sometimes these suspicions started quietly, almost casually. A woman might walk past a group of villagers and they'd fall silent. A child might cry and someone would mutter, "She looked at him funny yesterday." Over time, the murmurs added up. The woman didn't know it, but her name was starting to move from mouth to mouth, gathering weight. What's tragic is that it wasn't always about true belief. Sometimes it was about convenience. Someone owed a debt and didn't want to pay it back. Someone wanted land that the woman owned. Someone just didn't like her. In the wrong hands, an accusation of witchcraft became a tool. A way to punish, to control, to get rid of someone. It didn't need to be true, it only needed to sound possible. And once it started, once a few people began to question her behavior, others often joined in. Not always because they believed it, but because it was easier, safer. If you didn't join the crowd, you might be next. The line between safety and danger was so thin, so easy to cross, and so often drawn by the fragile emotions of a frightened community. A cough, a storm, a dead cow, a cold stare, these were the kinds of things that ended lives. In small 1600s villages, rumors didn't travel quietly, they lived and breathed in every corner, fed by close quarters and constant watchfulness. These were places where privacy was nearly non-existent. Everyone knew who baked what, who argued with whom, who hadn't shown up at Sunday church, and who was acting just a little bit strange. In these tight-knit communities, where suspicion always hung just below the surface, it didn't take much for an idea to spread. A single raised eyebrow, a muttered comment behind someone's back, or a suggestion made in the middle of a tense conversation could plant a seed. And once that seed was in the ground, it grew quickly, watered by gossip and fear. It might start with something small, like a cow falling ill or a woman's bread refusing to rise. Someone might shrug at first, blame it on chance, but then remember how their neighbor's expression had seemed strange the day before. Maybe she had looked at the animal for too long. Maybe she didn't greet them in the usual way. Maybe she said something odd last week. All of a sudden, that memory, which meant nothing at the time, takes on new weight. It shifts in the mind. And before long, the person shares their thoughts with someone else. Not as an accusation, not yet, but as a strange coincidence. A casual mention. A just thought, I'd say. The second person might nod, a little unsure. But maybe they've noticed something too, or maybe they just want to be agreeable. They bring it up in the next conversation. A third person adds their own recollection, even if it's flimsy. Didn't she have that odd cut on her hand the other day? Didn't she say something about the wind changing? Suddenly, a pattern starts to form, not based in truth, but in shared unease. And the more people who talk about it, the more legitimate it starts to feel. Each voice adds weight, even if none of them are speaking from direct experience. It becomes a collective construction, where repetition becomes evidence. As the rumors grow, people begin to rewrite their memories to fit the narrative. That's the frightening thing about human recollection. It's malleable. What once seemed normal now seems suspicious in hindsight. She used to walk in the woods alone. I always thought that was strange. She had that black cat. I didn't think much of it before, but now, retellings become more confident. Stories become sharper, more pointed. And each time the tale is told, it becomes less of a rumor and more of a certainty in people's minds. There's something deeply human about wanting to make sense of the world, especially when things go wrong. And in those villages, things often did. Crops failed. Illness struck without warning. Children died in their sleep. People lived close to death and desperation. So when something bad happened, they didn't want to believe it was random. They wanted a reason, a target, a shape for their fear. And when one person voiced that fear, others often latched onto it, not because it was logical, but because it made them feel safer to blame someone than to face the unknown. One of the most dangerous aspects of these rumors was that they were often shared not with malice, but with concern. People weren't always trying to destroy someone, they were afraid, and fear makes people reckless. A well-meaning neighbor might whisper to the village priest that something didn't feel right. The priest might raise the issue with the town magistrate. Suddenly, an informal conversation becomes an official inquiry. The woman being discussed may not even know the whispers have begun. By the time she realizes something is wrong, the web has already been woven around her. It was rare for these rumors to remain isolated. Once someone's name had been spoken with suspicion, others often felt compelled to join in. Some did it to protect themselves. If they repeated the rumor, they wouldn't look like they were hiding anything. Others truly believed it. And a few, sadly, took advantage of the moment. Maybe they had a grudge. Maybe they wanted her land or her possessions. Or maybe they simply liked the feeling of power that came from being listened to. In a society where many people felt powerless, especially women and the poor, being part of an accusation gave them a rare sense of importance. Over time, these murmurs became more than gossip, they became accusations. People started pointing to strange behavior. She talks to herself. She doesn't cry at funerals. She sings strange songs at night. These weren't crimes, but they were enough to raise suspicion in a place where normalcy was enforced with quiet but brutal rigidity. If someone stood out too much, if they didn't follow the unwritten rules, they became a threat to the social order. And threats had to be dealt with. By the time the authorities got involved, the accused often found themselves without allies. Even friends grew distant. People didn't want to be associated with someone who might bring danger on their household. A neighbor might avoid making eye contact. A friend might stop coming by. In the worst cases, people who had once shared bread and stories now stood on the side of the crowd, murmuring agreement as others called for justice. The woman in question might not even know who started it all. The original remark, the casual, almost forgettable comment, was now buried beneath layers of added fear, resentment, and false memory. There were moments when the accused tried to speak for themselves. They tried to explain, to protest, to calm the growing storm. But by that point, logic had little power. When people are afraid, they don't listen well. They don't think clearly. And in a small town, where everyone's lives are woven together tightly, it's easier to side with the many than with the one. The more people who believe, the harder it is to push back. The tide is too strong. As the days passed, the story would grow in complexity. Details were added. Embellishments became facts. Someone might claim they saw her speaking to an animal and hearing it reply. Someone else might say they saw her walking in the fields at midnight under the full moon. The accused might not even be aware of these stories until it was too late. Her name might be mentioned at the market in hushed voices. At church, others might refuse to sit near her. A child might run away from her in the road. The air around her thickens with fear, and she can feel it, even before anything is said to her directly. The village might not have had official scribes or formal records, but oral testimony was everything. If enough people said something, it became real. It didn't need to be proven, it needed to be believed. And belief spread faster than truth. The more a story was repeated, the more real it seemed. Even people who hadn't seen anything themselves might say, "Well, everyone's saying it, so it must be true." That was all it took. It wasn't uncommon for others to come forward with their own stories once they knew someone had been accused. Suddenly, everything made sense to them. The goat that wouldn't produce milk. The husband who took ill. The odd dream they had a few months back. They connected the dots, not because the dots were real, but because they needed something to blame. And once the dots were connected, they were nearly impossible to unpick. As the whispers turned to shouts and the stories turned to testimony, the fate of the accused was often sealed before any trial took place. She was no longer a person. She was a story, a warning, a symbol of fear. And in a small town built on survival, people were more than willing to sacrifice one person to protect the rest. The spread of rumor wasn't just social, it was almost ritual. A shared agreement that fear must have a name. A shared decision to choose that name together. And so the rumors that began with a single voice ended with a chorus. She was no longer a person, she was a symbol of fear, a story everyone had agreed to believe. And when the rumors reached the ears of those in charge, whether it was a village constable, a priest, a town judge, or an outside magistrate, the wheels of authority began to turn. The accused, often unaware of the full force gathering against her, would soon face something far more frightening than whispered gossip. She would be taken. The moment of arrest often came with little warning. Sometimes it was early in the morning, just as the sun began to rise. Other times, it came at night when the world was quiet and cold. A knock at the door, loud, deliberate, followed by voices. Not kind ones. The sort of voices that didn't wait to be invited in. A group of men, sometimes with a town official among them, would stand at the threshold with stern expressions and no warmth in their eyes. They might carry torches, staffs, ropes. Their presence was not a question, it was a declaration. The accused might be cooking, tending to a child, or simply sitting by the hearth when the men stepped in. She might not even know what they were there for, not really. But the feeling would settle in her stomach instantly. That sinking weight. That sense that something had gone terribly wrong and could not be undone. They would tell her she was under suspicion. The words were formal. Cold. Not quite an accusation, but not far from it either. She was to come with them. For questioning. That was how it usually began. There was rarely room for argument. If she protested, she might be grabbed. If she cried, it was seen as a sign of guilt. If she stayed silent, they'd say she was cold or unrepentant. There was no right way to react, because they had already decided what they believed. The arrest wasn't the beginning of her story, it was already the middle. The crowd had done its part. The village had played its role. Now came the ritual of removal. Neighbors might gather to watch. Some would stay in doorways or peek from behind curtains. Others would come out into the street. Children clung to their mothers. Some whispered. Some stared. A few threw stones. The accused was led through her own village like a criminal, even if nothing had been proven. Her feet moved forward, but her mind raced backward, trying to understand what had happened, trying to remember what she might have done or said to bring this on. But the more she thought, the less sense it made. She wasn't being punished for a crime. She was being taken for who she was. She might be bound, not always with chains, but sometimes with ropes, or even held between two men, her arms gripped tightly. The path she walked was one she knew well, past the fields, the bakery, the church where she had once sung hymns with the same people now averting their eyes. And as she walked, she could feel the absence of support. No one stepped forward. No one offered comfort. Fear held their mouths shut. To speak out would be to invite suspicion onto themselves. The destination varied. Some were taken to a town hall, others to a makeshift cell or a small prison attached to a courthouse. In poorer areas, it could be just a room with a barred window and a heavy wooden door. But the act of taking her there, the process of walking her through town, of showing everyone that she had been separated, was part of the punishment. It was meant to humiliate, to strip her of dignity before any verdict had even been spoken. The home she left behind was not just a house. It was everything she had built, her possessions, her memories, the spaces where she had been safe. All of that was now left behind, vulnerable to theft or destruction. In some cases, her belongings were confiscated. In others, they were simply abandoned. If she lived alone, no one tended the fire or fed the animals. If she had children, they were often left in the care of reluctant neighbors or taken away entirely. For women with family members still alive, especially daughters or sisters, the arrest was doubly painful. Those relatives became tainted by association. They too were watched, whispered about, questioned. Sometimes, they were accused as well. Guilt, in the eyes of the community, was contagious. It passed from hand to hand like sickness, until whole families were drawn into the shadow. The men who took her away might not have been cruel individually. Some were frightened. Some were just doing what they thought was right. Others were deeply religious and believed they were saving the village by removing evil. But regardless of their motives, the act itself was terrifying. It was public. It was deliberate. It was a message to everyone else. This is what happens to those who are different. This is what happens to those who stand out. Once the accused reached the place of holding, the door would close behind her with a sound that echoed. Final. Thick. She was now officially in the hands of the law, or what passed for it in a time where fear often outweighed truth. Her name would be entered into a record, her presence noted. But no lawyer would come. No advocate would arrive. She would wait in silence for what came next. That silence was often the worst part. The hours after the arrest, before the interrogation began, were heavy with dread. She would sit in the dim light, surrounded by stone or wood, the air damp and bitter. The same questions circled her mind. Who had spoken her name? Why had they done it? What could she say to make it stop? But she knew, deep down, that her words alone might not be enough. She had been taken not because of evidence, but because of belief. And belief, once rooted, was harder to fight than any enemy. Sometimes the arrest was accompanied by prayer. Officials might speak sacred words, not to offer comfort but to protect themselves. They believed they were dealing with a servant of the devil. They might wear protective charms, carry crosses, or mutter Latin phrases. The accused wasn't just a woman anymore, she was a vessel for evil in their eyes. And that meant any cruelty inflicted on her was not only justified, it was necessary. The walk from her doorstep to her prison wasn't long in distance, but in experience, it stretched forever. It marked a shift from normalcy to nightmare. The familiar world tilted sideways, and everything she had known was now dangerous. The people who had once laughed with her now watched in silence. The road she had walked 1,000 times now led to darkness. She didn't know what would happen next, but she understood that her life was no longer hers to shape. And as the door shut behind her, and the noise of the village faded, she was left alone. The walls around her didn't just hold her body, they held her story, her past, her memories. All of them now in question. Every word she had spoken, every choice she had made, every silence she had kept was being rewritten by others. And the worst part was knowing that the ones who wrote those stories might never have to prove a thing. Her truth didn't matter anymore. Only the fear that had taken root in the hearts of others did. The moment she was locked inside, the weight of it all began to settle around her like the damp in the air. The prison or holding cell, if you could even call it that, wasn't designed for dignity, or even survival. It was a place of waiting, of punishment, of fear. Some of these cells were nothing more than stone-walled basements beneath churches or town halls, while others were old storehouses or barns that had been converted into holding spaces for the accused. But no matter the structure, they all shared the same crushing features: darkness, cold, and a silence broken only by distant footsteps or the scrape of rats. The walls were thick, rough, and wet to the touch. Sometimes made of stone, sometimes crumbling clay or wood, they sweated with moisture no matter the season. There were no windows, or if there were, they were tiny slits far too high to reach, letting in just enough light to remind her of how far she was from the world outside. In winter, the chill seemed to crawl through the walls, entering her bones, never leaving. In summer, the air turned thick and sour, as sweat mingled with the stench of mold and unwashed bodies. There was no bed. If she was lucky, a pile of old straw might have been thrown into the corner, but most often, it was the bare ground she lay on, hard, uneven, and cold. The earth itself felt unforgiving. She might curl into herself, trying to keep warm, trying to hold on to something, anything, that still felt like comfort. But there were no blankets, no pillows, no fire to warm the air. Just the constant sound of dripping water or the scuttling of unseen creatures. Hygiene was not even a consideration. There was no chamber pot. If she needed to relieve herself, she had to do it in the same space where she slept, in the same dark corner where she had already cried, prayed, or screamed. The smell built up fast, sour and heavy. The longer she was kept there, the more the stench soaked into her clothes, her skin, her hair. And with no change of clothes, no basin of water, and certainly no soap, there was nothing she could do about it. Food came once a day, if it came at all. It was rarely more than a chunk of stale bread or a bowl of thin broth that tasted of little and offered even less. The guards, if there were any assigned to her, didn't speak much. They slid the food through the door, or sometimes opened it just long enough to toss the plate in as if she was something less than human. She would eat with her fingers, crouched on the dirt floor, grateful for anything that filled her stomach but sickened by the indignity of it. Time inside that place stretched in strange ways. With no sun, no clock, no candle to mark the hours, she began to lose track. Was it morning? Was it night? Had she been here 2 days? 5? Her body ached, her thoughts wandered, and the silence pressed in on her like a second skin. Sometimes, she would hear others, distant voices, crying, calling out, but most of the time, it was just her breath, her heartbeat, and the dull rhythm of fear. And always, there was the cold. Not just the physical chill, but something deeper, like the cold of being forgotten. It settled in her stomach and spread outwards, a steady, quiet terror. She had no idea when she would be taken out of this place, or if she ever would. There was no trial date, no advocate coming to speak for her, no one reassuring her that this was just a misunderstanding. Instead, the only certainty was uncertainty. The loneliness was its own kind of torment. In the village, she had once been surrounded by people, neighbors, friends, even those who simply nodded politely as they passed. But here, in this place, she was utterly alone. Her name was not spoken aloud. Her face was seen by no one. Her story was frozen in time, paused somewhere between accusation and judgment. Every day that passed chipped away at her hope. She tried to stay strong. She tried to hold on to memories of laughter, warmth, or faith. But even those memories began to feel far away, like dreams slipping between her fingers. Some women whispered prayers, muttering them like mantras to keep the fear at bay. Others sang softly, old lullabies or sacred hymns. Still others sat in silence, staring at the walls as if they could will themselves out. No one in those cells was truly themselves anymore. They were worn down, not just by hunger and cold, but by the suffocating weight of what might come next. Insects were common: lice, fleas, spiders. They nested in the straw, crept along the cracks, or crawled across her skin as she slept. Rats were bold and often large. Sometimes they would steal what little food she had, or nibble at her clothing, or simply watch from the corners with those eerie eyes that glinted in the dark. She couldn't scream. No one would come. She couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. Sleep came in short bursts, more like fainting than resting. Her body gave in when it could, but the cold and fear often kept her awake. The door, when it opened, brought a rush of panic. Each creak, each set of approaching footsteps was a potential end. Would it be someone coming to question her? To hurt her? To take her to the square? Or worse, was it silence again? If there were others imprisoned nearby, she might hear them. A cough. A sob. The sound of someone being dragged down the hall. But they were only ghosts to her, other shadows in the dark. She would not see them, only imagine them. She wondered if they had families. If they were innocent too. If any of them would survive. There was no mirror in that cell. She didn't know what she looked like anymore. Her hair tangled, her face pale or bruised, her hands dirty and shaking. She could feel herself shrinking, not in size, but in spirit. The person she had been was slipping away. What remained was something quieter, more afraid. Something that knew it would not be believed no matter what it said. Hope flickered rarely, like a candle in wind. Maybe someone would come. Maybe someone from the village still believed in her. But that hope was dangerous. Each day it lived and died again. The darkness did not allow much room for it. And so she waited, cold, hungry, forgotten. The cell was more than just a prison. It was a place of unmaking, where the world slowly erased her, piece by piece. The door creaked open again, just like it had the day before, and the day before that. She had no way of knowing how many days had passed since she'd first been locked away, but her body told her time had moved. Her muscles ached in ways they hadn't before. Her stomach was no longer hungry. It was empty in a way that no food could fix. Her mind had started to fray at the edges, and that was precisely the condition they wanted her in when the questioning began. Interrogations were not always immediate. Sometimes they waited until the accused was weakened, both physically and mentally. They knew that time was an accomplice. It eroded defenses, softened memory, and dulled the sharp edge of resistance. The longer she was left to rot in that cold, filthy cell, the more likely she was to break, and that's exactly what they needed. Not truth. Not innocence. Just a confession. They would come for her during the night, or just before dawn when her body was most tired and her spirit already defeated by hours of sleeplessness. Sleep deprivation was one of the most common tools they used. It didn't leave visible marks, but it worked like poison. After enough time without rest, the line between what was real and what wasn't began to blur. Thoughts spiraled into confusion. Questions became harder to answer. Words slurred and stumbled. She might say things she didn't mean, just to stop the questions, to end the staring, to silence the voices demanding that she explain herself. Sometimes the questioning took place in small, dark rooms lit only by candles or flickering torches. Other times it happened in front of panels of stern-faced men, magistrates, priests, local leaders. They sat behind tables, writing in ledgers, watching her with eyes that held no empathy. Her hands might be bound. She might be made to kneel. They often preferred when she knelt. It made her feel small, powerless. That sense of inferiority was useful. They asked the same things over and over again. Do you consort with the devil? Did you cause the storm that ruined the crops? Were you seen speaking to a black cat? Have you cursed anyone in the village? Who else is in league with you? These questions weren't meant to be answered with truth, they were meant to corner her. The longer she denied, the harsher the tone became. The more she tried to explain, the more her words were twisted and used against her. They'd use the Bible, quote scripture, speak of salvation if she confessed, and damnation if she resisted. It wasn't just physical pressure, it was emotional, spiritual. They told her God was watching, that her soul could still be saved, that denying her crimes was worse than committing them. Her silence was taken as guilt. Her confusion was taken as deception. And when words weren't enough, they used pain. It wasn't always the kind that left bruises. Psychological pain could be just as effective. They might isolate her, let her hear others being hurt, or pretend that someone had already confessed and implicated her. They'd lie, and they'd do it convincingly. Your neighbor said you met in the forest. We already know what you did, just admit it. These lies chipped away at whatever clarity she had left. Then there was the real torture. The kind that turned questions into weapons. Her thumbs might be crushed in a device made of iron screws. Her legs locked into wooden stocks that stretched and twisted the joints. Needles were sometimes driven beneath her fingernails. Her arms could be tied behind her and then hoisted upward, a method called strappado, until her shoulders dislocated. She might be beaten, or burned, or simply threatened with these things while made to watch others endure them. Sometimes she was stripped and searched for the devil's mark, a spot on the body, usually a mole or scar, that was said to be insensitive to pain and proof of a pact with Satan. They would poke her skin with sharp needles, over and over, until they found such a spot, or simply said they had. Modesty was stripped from her as easily as her clothing. The shame alone was a tool. If she cried, they said the devil was trying to escape through her tears. If she didn't cry, they said it was proof she had no soul. There was no right way to respond. Every answer became a noose, every silence a confession. Eventually, many women gave in. Not because they were guilty, but because their bodies couldn't take any more. Because their minds were breaking. Because they were promised that confession might spare them death. Or because they thought if they just said the words the interrogators wanted to hear, they might be allowed to rest, to eat, to live. The sad truth was that even a confession didn't guarantee mercy. Often, it just sped up the execution. Some confessed to flying through the night sky with the devil, to turning milk sour, to making a man impotent. They spoke of secret sabbats, of kissing the devil's backside, of speaking with animals that turned into demons. All impossible things. All coerced through fear, pain, and exhaustion. And when the confession was finally written down, the words were never truly hers. They belonged to the men who had put them there. They wrote what they wanted. They left out the begging, the screams, the pleas for water. They simply recorded, "She confessed." And that was enough. Even after confessing, she wasn't allowed peace. The questioning might continue. They might ask for more names, more witches, more stories. Confessing often meant dragging others into the nightmare, sometimes even her own children or neighbors. Refusing to do so was seen as stubbornness, as pride, as proof that the devil still held sway over her soul. Her voice, once hers alone, now became a tool they used to damn others. And if she refused to speak, if she shut her mouth tight, they found ways to open it. Pain has a way of unlocking even the most steadfast silence. By the time the questioning was over, she might not even recognize herself. Her face swollen, her body broken, her spirit hanging by threads. But they had what they wanted, a confession. And with it, they had permission to move to the next stage. And still, in the back of her mind, one thought lingered: they never really cared if she was a witch. They called them tests, but there was never any fairness in them. These trials were not about discovering the truth, they were about confirming suspicions, reinforcing fear, and demonstrating the authority of those in charge. In a time when the line between the natural and the supernatural was blurry, physical signs were seen as direct evidence of a person's spiritual corruption. And so, the body itself became a battleground where innocence and guilt were supposedly written into skin, flesh, and water. The most infamous of these tests was the dunking, often called the swimming test. The accused woman, or man, though it was usually a woman, would be brought before the crowd, sometimes bound at the hands and feet, and led to a nearby river or pond. A rope might be tied around her waist, supposedly for safety, but it also served as a leash. The idea behind the test was simple, cruel, and steeped in twisted logic. Water, being pure, would reject the unholy. If she floated, the water had cast her out, proof that she was aligned with the devil. If she sank, the water had accepted her, proving her innocence, though by then, she might already be drowned. People watched, holding their breath as the accused was lowered into the cold water. Villagers stood along the banks, priests looked on solemnly, and magistrates recorded the event. Floating was unnatural, they said. It was a sign of witchcraft. But anyone who's ever seen someone bound and tossed into water knows the truth. Human bodies sometimes float, especially when struggling for breath, especially when tied in a certain way. But in the superstitious logic of the time, nature itself had to obey religious belief. So if she floated, they pulled her out and declared her guilty. If she drowned, they called it unfortunate, but her soul was at peace. Another common test was the search for the devil's mark. It was believed that witches bore a sign on their body, a mark left by Satan during their pact. This mark could take many forms: a mole, a birthmark, a scar, a skin tag. Anything that looked slightly different. To find it, the accused was often stripped of her clothing in front of a group of examiners, sometimes in public, more often in dimly lit chambers. A panel of older men, sometimes joined by so-called witch prickers or midwives brought in as experts, would inspect every inch of skin, looking for an imperfection that could be claimed as evidence. When a mark was found, they didn't stop there. The mark had to be tested. A long, sharp needle or bodkin, a thin blade, was used to prick the spot. If it bled, or if the accused flinched or cried out, the examiners sometimes claimed it wasn't the right mark. But if no pain was shown, or if no blood came, that was seen as confirmation. The devil's mark was said to be numb and bloodless. Of course, if they poked too shallowly, or picked an area with thick skin or poor circulation, they could create the result they wanted. And they often did. Witch prickers were particularly notorious. Some were charlatans who carried retractable needles that created the illusion of a deep stab without actually piercing the skin. No pain, no blood, instant guilt. Others were simply thorough and brutal, poking and stabbing the accused again and again, often dozens or even hundreds of times, until they found, or invented, the proof they were paid to produce. Then there was the touch test, which was sometimes used in cases where a victim of supposed witchcraft had fallen ill or entered a fit. The theory went like this: if the afflicted person had a seizure or a strange episode in the presence of the accused witch, and that fit stopped when the accused touched them, then it meant she had caused the ailment in the first place. Of course, the entire setup was steeped in stagecraft and suggestion. The victim might be terrified or manipulated. The accused, confused and horrified, might not even understand what was happening. And to the crowd, it all looked like damning evidence. Some tests were even more primitive. They involved tying the accused to a chair and weighing them against a heavy Bible, or seeing if their hair could be braided backwards by the wind. Others involved making them walk backward, or speak words in reverse, or hold a hot iron bar. There was no consistency, no scientific method, no reason behind it, just fear dressed up as process. Even behavior was tested. If she looked someone in the eye too long, it was a sign of manipulation. If she avoided eye contact, she was hiding something. If she wept, the devil was inside her, trying to escape. If she remained calm, it was a sure sign she had no conscience. The accused was always wrong, no matter what she did. Every action was reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion and dread. Animals were used too. Cats and toads, especially black ones, were seen as familiars, demonic creatures sent to assist the witch. If such an animal was seen near her home, it was enough to arouse suspicion. If she fed it or spoke to it, that was even worse. The test, in this case, was sometimes just observation. And in those times, observation didn't mean documentation. It meant gossip, retellings, half-remembered details repeated until they became truth. These tests weren't just about proving guilt. They were a form of punishment in themselves. They humiliated, wounded, and terrified. They reminded the entire village what could happen to anyone, any woman, any neighbor, who stepped too far outside the accepted roles. And they gave people a sense of power, a feeling that the community could protect itself from unseen evils by finding and destroying a scapegoat. But there was never a test for innocence. There was no way to prove you hadn't made a pact with the devil. Once the suspicion had taken root, no amount of compliance or explanation could dig it out. The tests were a performance, and the ending had already been written. The accused was just there to play her part. She could scream her innocence until her voice gave out. She could endure pain, exposure, humiliation. She could do everything asked of her, pass every ordeal, and still find herself accused, convicted, and condemned. The tests were a ritual, but not one that purified. They were a ritual of destruction, cloaked in the language of justice. And still, the people watched. Some in horror, some in silence, some with grim satisfaction. Because deep down, many of them believed, better her than me. The trial process, if it could even be called that, was less about fairness or justice and more about solidifying public suspicion into a permanent and final conclusion. Once someone was accused of witchcraft and the various tests were performed, no matter how cruel or absurd, what followed was often little more than a performance, a final act in a play where everyone already knew the ending. These trials were not held in the grand halls of reason or law. They took place in small town halls, cramped churches, or makeshift courtrooms assembled wherever a group of local magistrates or clergy could gather. And in many ways, the trial wasn't truly about discovering guilt or innocence. It was about confirming what people already believed. There was no defense lawyer, no advocate for the accused. That role simply didn't exist in most of these proceedings. The accused woman, often weary, frightened, and already physically abused by tests or imprisonment, had to stand alone. She had no legal expertise, no one to argue her case, no one to object when the crowd grew restless or when witnesses told stories that bent the truth. Often, she wasn't even allowed to speak freely. If she protested too loudly, she was told that her anger proved her guilt. If she stayed silent, it meant the devil had stolen her voice. The evidence presented was rarely physical, and it almost never had anything to do with logic. Instead, trials relied heavily on hearsay, stories, impressions, dreams, and even outright lies. A neighbor might say they had seen her talking to her cat late at night. A child might say they had a bad dream where she appeared and whispered curses. Someone might swear they saw her walking alone through a field where the crops later failed. The accusations could be trivial, contradictory, or completely nonsensical. It didn't matter. Once enough people had spoken against her, the court usually took that as enough proof. Some testimony came from people the accused had known her whole life. Former friends, old neighbors, even family members sometimes took the stand, not always out of malice, but often out of fear. In a village gripped by panic, it was safer to distance yourself from the accused. Safer to agree than to speak up. Some witnesses offered only vague observations. She seemed strange, she didn't attend church often enough, she knew things others didn't. That alone could be damning. Others told wild stories, claiming they had seen her vanish into thin air, speak in an unknown tongue, or fly across the moonlight. In the pressure of a public trial, fantasy and memory blended together. Many of these courts allowed the use of spectral evidence. That meant someone could testify that they had seen the accused witch's spirit, or spectre, appear to them in a dream or vision. If someone said they had seen her face floating above their bed at night or felt invisible hands choking them while she was supposedly asleep in her cell, that was considered valid evidence. No proof was required beyond the accuser's word. And the more emotional or dramatic their testimony, the more likely it was to sway the court. Sometimes, the accused would be forced to recount her life in great detail, and anything unusual could be turned against her. If she had once argued with a neighbor and that neighbor's cow later died, that could be labeled a curse. If she had assisted in childbirth and the baby didn't survive, she was suspected of interfering with nature. If she had knowledge of herbs or healing, it was assumed she had gained it through unnatural means. In an age where women were discouraged from learning or leading, any sign of independence could become a mark of guilt. Confessions, even those clearly obtained under duress, were treated as the strongest proof. If the accused had broken under torture and confessed to meeting the devil in the woods or attending a sabbath of witches, that story would be read aloud in court, often to gasps and murmurs from the crowd. Even if she later retracted it, explaining that she'd only said those things after days without sleep or food, no one listened. The confession had served its purpose. It had cemented the story people wanted to hear. There was no cross-examination. No one was allowed to question the motives of the accusers or the accuracy of the evidence. Trials were meant to protect the community from the perceived evil within. And once a person had been named a witch, they were no longer seen as part of that community. They were already set apart, dehumanized, demonic, untrustworthy. The tone of these trials varied. Some were solemn and quiet, with judges in robes and townspeople seated in silence, listening intently. Others were loud and chaotic, more like public spectacles. People brought their children, whispered to each other, pointed fingers. Some even laughed. The accused stood in the center of it all, not just on trial in front of a court, but under the judgment of the entire town. Every glance, every whispered word, every fearful expression, she saw it all. Even the judges were not impartial. Many were deeply religious men who believed they were doing God's work. Others were politicians or landowners with reputations to protect. Declaring someone a witch was a way to show strength, to demonstrate that they were rooting out evil. Few were interested in nuance or doubt. They needed to be seen as decisive, unshakable. After all, if they let a suspected witch go free and something terrible happened afterward, a storm, a fire, a plague, they would be blamed. Sometimes, the trials lasted days. Sometimes, only a few hours. But the outcome was almost always the same. Once the accusation was made and the machinery of suspicion set in motion, there were very few exits. The accused rarely escaped with their life or their reputation intact. Even those who were spared execution lived the rest of their lives as outcasts. Some communities conducted these trials with a grim sense of duty, while others did so with disturbing enthusiasm. The line between justice and vengeance blurred quickly, and beneath it all was the constant hum of fear, the fear of the unknown, the fear of difference, the fear of punishment, and the fear of being next. It was not a legal process, not in any sense we would recognize today. It was closer to ritual, to a purging of perceived sin. It was meant to restore a sense of order, to reassure the town that the evil had been identified and would be removed. And yet, with every trial, the fear only deepened. Because deep down, everyone knew the truth. There didn't need to be a reason. There didn't need to be evidence. It could happen to anyone. When the trial concluded, the moment everyone dreaded finally arrived, the sentencing. The accused, already weakened physically and emotionally, stood before the court as the judge prepared to announce the verdict. This moment was heavy with tension, not only for the accused but for the entire community that had gathered to witness the final act of this tragic drama. The courtroom, or whatever space had been designated, often fell into a heavy silence as people waited. The judge, usually a stern man clad in simple but authoritative robes, read aloud the decision with a voice that left no room for doubt or mercy. The verdict was straightforward and chilling: guilty of witchcraft. In most cases, the sentence was death. Sometimes it was hanging, other times pressing, but most notoriously, especially in the 1600s and regions like England and parts of continental Europe, it was death by burning. The judge's pronouncement was not just a formal declaration. It was a public statement meant to reaffirm the court's authority and to signal to the community that evil had been purged. The words were often met with murmurs of approval or grim satisfaction, but for the accused, they were the death knell. There was little chance for appeal or mercy. The concept of innocent until proven guilty was virtually non-existent. Once labeled a witch, the individual's fate was sealed. In some rare instances, petitions for clemency were made, but these were generally ignored or outright rejected. The community needed to believe that justice had been done, and that required a final, visible punishment. Following the verdict, preparations for the execution began quickly. The accused might be held in the same dank prison cell, but now the knowledge of their imminent death pressed heavily on them. For the villagers, the execution was often seen as both a necessary act of justice and a grim spectacle. It was intended to reinforce social order, to remind everyone of the dangers of straying from accepted norms, and to instill fear in those who might consider similar sins. On the day of the execution, the condemned were often led out in a procession. This was not a private or hidden event, it was deliberately public. The path from the prison or holding place to the execution site might pass through the town's main streets, ensuring that the maximum number of people could witness the punishment. Sometimes families or neighbors followed, their faces masks of sorrow, fear, or grim acceptance. Once at the execution site, the accused was tied to a wooden stake. This was often a simple structure, placed in a clearing or at the edge of town, chosen to make the event visible from a distance. The victim's hands and feet were bound securely to prevent any escape attempts or struggles. This was a moment of utter helplessness, a final physical submission, just as they had been broken emotionally and mentally over the course of their ordeal. The wood used for the pyre was often gathered by townsfolk, sometimes even by the accused's neighbors or family members. This act further symbolized the community's collective judgment and rejection. The pile of dry wood or brush was stacked high enough to ensure a swift and devastating fire once lit. There was a grim ritualistic quality to the proceedings. Prayers might be offered by the clergy, sermons delivered to the crowd warning against the devil's influence, and the condemned might be given a final chance to confess or repent. The lighting of the fire was the last act. A torch or flame was brought to the base of the pyre, and the flames began to consume the wood, climbing steadily upward. The smoke and heat would quickly engulf the accused, bringing an agonizing end to their suffering. For onlookers, the burning was a spectacle both horrifying and strangely captivating, a brutal reminder of the consequences of deviating from the rigid social and religious codes of the time. In some cases, the condemned were strangled or killed by a blow before the fire fully consumed them, a grim kindness meant to spare them the worst agony. But more often, the fire was the final punishment, meant to cleanse the town of the wickedness embodied by the accused. The belief was that the flames purified the soul, preventing the devil from claiming the witch's body after death. The crowd's reaction to these executions varied. Some watched in silent horror, unable to look away yet deeply disturbed. Others cheered or shouted prayers, believing they were witnessing divine justice. Children were sometimes brought along, taught to fear the devil and the consequences of witchcraft from a young age. This reinforced the cycle of fear and superstition that would fuel further accusations in the years to come. After the fire burned low and the ashes cooled, the remains were often collected and buried in unmarked graves, far from the churchyard. The accused were denied the sacred rites of Christian burial, further reinforcing their status as outcasts, even in death. This was part of the punishment, a final erasure of their place within the community and society at large. The execution did not always bring closure. In many villages, the trauma lingered. Families of the accused were stigmatized and shunned, their homes sometimes abandoned or vandalized. The community might feel a mix of relief and guilt, relief that the witch was gone, but guilt or unease that an innocent might have suffered. For many, the memory of the burning haunted the town for years, a dark chapter in its history. At times, executions were carried out swiftly after the trial. In other cases, the condemned waited days or weeks, enduring further suffering in prison. The anticipation of death was a torment in itself. The social pressure to confess or repent was immense, and the accused often faced this final period in isolation, cut off from loved ones. Public executions served as grim lessons. They were meant to scare others into conformity, to make examples of those who dared to challenge or differ from the norms. The spectacle of death by fire was a vivid, terrifying warning, a manifestation of the period's intense fear of witchcraft and the supernatural. The method of execution, particularly burning, was laden with symbolic meaning. Fire was associated with purification but also with hell and eternal damnation. To be burned as a witch was to be destroyed physically and spiritually, a fate worse than death for many at the time. In some places, the sentence could vary. Hanging was common in England, while burning was more prevalent in continental Europe. Pressing, where heavy weights were placed on the accused until they suffocated, was a brutal alternative used in places like colonial America. Each method was designed to be both punitive and exemplary, to underline the perceived severity of the crime. Despite the finality of the sentence, the aftermath of the execution often rippled through the community. Fear did not simply dissipate. Instead, it often intensified, feeding the next round of accusations and trials. People were left wondering who might be next, what hidden evils lurked nearby, and how they could protect themselves. Executions, especially by burning, were public rituals meant to enforce conformity through terror. They combined legal authority, religious fervor, and community participation in a spectacle of punishment. The accused was stripped of all dignity, subjected to the ultimate form of social and physical destruction. This grim conclusion to the witch trial process stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history, revealing how fear, superstition, and cruelty can intertwine to produce unimaginable suffering. The sentenced woman, once part of a living community, was reduced to a symbol of evil, consumed by flames as a warning to all. The final night before execution was often the loneliest, most harrowing moment in the accused witch's tragic journey. By this point, she was isolated from almost everyone she knew and loved. Guards or wardens would separate her from other prisoners, placing her in a small, cold, and bare cell or chamber designed not for comfort but for containment. The room might have been damp, with rough stone walls, little to no light, and only the barest provisions, if any at all. This physical isolation was a cruel mirror of her social isolation, as most of the village had turned away from her, and even family members might have distanced themselves, fearful of association. Emotionally, the accused faced a maelstrom of feelings. Fear was undoubtedly the most overwhelming: fear of the impending death, fear of the pain to come, and fear of what awaited her soul beyond this life. In the 1600s, belief in the afterlife was profound, and many condemned witches agonized not only over their physical fate but their eternal salvation. Was she truly damned? Had the devil already claimed her soul? These questions haunted the mind, compounding the terror of death. Yet, amid the fear, some found solace in prayer or spiritual reflection. The accused might have prayed for forgiveness, for strength, or for mercy from God. The clergy, if they were allowed or called upon, might have visited to offer last rites, a religious ritual designed to prepare the soul for death and grant spiritual comfort. These moments, though brief, could be a rare glimmer of hope and peace in an otherwise bleak night. Others might have used the final hours to mentally recount their lives, their childhood, family, moments of happiness or regret. With so much time to reflect, the mind could wander through memories, sometimes to find comfort, sometimes to torture itself with guilt or despair. Some may have hoped for a last-minute miracle, a sudden pardon, or a way to escape their fate, even if deep down they knew such hope was futile. Physically, the condemned woman was likely weakened from weeks or months of harsh treatment, malnutrition, and psychological torment. The weight of imprisonment, interrogation, and public humiliation wore heavily on the body. Many endured illness or injuries sustained during questioning or confinement, and now faced the reality that their body was close to breaking down completely. Sleep, if it came at all, was fitful and brief. Anxiety and dread made rest nearly impossible. The mind raced with thoughts of the morrow, the fire, the crowd, and the unknown. The accused might have felt a profound loneliness, even abandonment, as the world outside their cell continued on while they awaited their final hours in silence and darkness. The guards or officials assigned to watch over the condemned were usually stern and unsympathetic, offering little comfort. Sometimes they mocked or jeered, reminding the prisoner of their supposed guilt and impending doom. Other times, they were simply indifferent, carrying out their duties with routine detachment. In some cases, the accused might have been given simple comforts such as bread or water, but often these were withheld or provided in insufficient quantities. The deprivation was part of the punishment, meant to further weaken the prisoner and crush their spirit. The final night was also marked by silence. The village itself might have quieted as the community prepared for the execution. Some townspeople stayed indoors, unwilling to witness the gruesome event, while others gathered near the execution site, eager to see justice done at dawn. If any visitors, family members, friends, or clergy, came, the meetings were brief and heavily supervised. Conversations were often limited to final farewells or spiritual counsel. Emotions ran high. Some might have wept openly, while others maintained stoic silence, fearful of drawing suspicion on themselves. For the condemned, time seemed both agonizingly slow and terrifyingly fast. Each minute stretched endlessly as they awaited the moment when they would be dragged from their cell and led to the pyre. Yet, the inevitability of death pressed down like an invisible weight, suffocating hope and filling the night with a profound sense of finality. Many accused witches spent these last hours alone with their thoughts, battling despair, clinging to faith, or steeling themselves for what was to come. Some might have resolved to die with dignity, while others resigned themselves to their fate with a hollow numbness. In rare instances, accused women maintained their innocence to the very end, refusing to confess or admit guilt. This steadfastness could sometimes prolong the ordeal, as authorities pushed harder for a confession, fearing that an unrepentant which might bring further evil. Others, overwhelmed by torture or hopelessness, might have finally confessed in hopes of mercy, though such mercy was rarely granted. The psychological torment of the final night was a crucible of human endurance. It exposed raw emotions, terror, sorrow, anger, hope, and despair, all intertwining in a fragile, fleeting balance. It was a time when the accused faced the full weight of society's fear and cruelty, alone in the darkness. For many, this night was the last moment of conscious life. It was a silent, private tragedy set against the backdrop of public spectacle soon to come. The echoes of their suffering and prayers often lingered long after the flames had died down, haunting the memories of those who witnessed or remembered the execution. The final night before execution was a testament to the human spirit caught in the cruel machinery of superstition and injustice. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, stripped of all pretense, where the accused faced the ultimate reckoning not just with death but with the society that condemned her. When the morning of the execution finally arrived, the atmosphere in the village was heavy with tension, dread, and a morbid curiosity that had been building for days or even weeks. Public executions by burning were not just acts of punishment. They were spectacles designed to serve as warnings, rituals meant to reinforce the social order and the power of religious and civic authorities. For the condemned woman, it was the culmination of a horrific ordeal, a terrifying moment when her fate would be sealed in front of an audience that often included her neighbors, acquaintances, and sometimes even family members. The journey from the prison or holding cell to the execution site was itself a public event. The accused was often dragged or led through the streets, bound in chains or ropes, with guards flanking her on all sides. The procession was loud and visible. Guards shouted orders, onlookers whispered or jeered, and the weight of impending doom pressed upon the condemned. This public display served multiple purposes. It was a way to humiliate the accused, to heighten the drama for the crowd, and to remind everyone of the consequences of deviating from accepted norms. The execution site was typically an open area near the village center or on the outskirts, where a wooden stake and a pile of dry wood or kindling had been prepared in advance. The stake was often rough and splintered, sturdy enough to hold the condemned upright as the flames consumed her. Around the stake, officials and clergy might be present, overseeing the ritual and ensuring that it adhered to the prescribed order. Once at the stake, the accused was bound, hands tied to the stake itself, legs secured so she could not move or escape. The bindings were usually coarse ropes, sometimes painful to the skin, adding to the physical torment. In some cases, additional restraints might be used, such as iron shackles or chains, further emphasizing the prisoner's helplessness. The crowd gathered closely, forming a dense ring around the execution site. This audience was made up of a mix of emotions. Some were grimly serious, viewing the punishment as necessary justice. Others were fearful, caught up in the hysteria that had led to the accusation, and many were morbidly fascinated, drawn by the spectacle of death. Children might be there, forced or curious, learning from an early age the harsh lessons of authority and obedience. Before the flames were lit, a final sermon or declaration might be read aloud by a priest or magistrate. This speech was often heavy with religious rhetoric, condemning the accused as a servant of the devil and a corrupter of the community. It was meant to reinforce the moral justification for the execution and to reassure the spectators that the community was purging itself of evil. The accused might be given a last chance to confess or repent, a moment to appeal to God for mercy. Some would pray aloud, others remained silent, and a few might scream or cry out in despair. The emotional intensity of this moment was overwhelming, charged with fear, anger, and resignation. As the fire was set, the kindling around the stake was ignited, the flames creeping upward and quickly engulfing the wood. The crackling and roar of the fire filled the air, mingling with the gasps and cries of the crowd. The smoke and heat rose, creating a hellish scene that was both terrifying and mesmerizing to watch. The woman tied to the stake faced excruciating pain as the flames licked her skin, burning her clothing and flesh. Death by burning was slow and agonizing, often taking several minutes or more, during which the victim might scream, convulse, or fall unconscious. The crowd's reaction varied. Some prayed for her soul, others shouted or jeered, and a few might have looked away, unable to bear the horror. The ritualistic nature of the burning was steeped in symbolism. Fire was seen as a purifier, a tool to cleanse the community of the witch's evil influence. The stake itself symbolized both punishment and sacrifice, a grim altar where the accused was offered to atone for sins real or imagined. The public nature of the event underscored the communal aspect of justice and served as a chilling deterrent to others. In some cases, officials might have intervened to hasten death, such as by strangling the accused before the flames fully took hold, a practice meant to spare the condemned the worst suffering. However, this was not guaranteed and depended on local customs and the disposition of the executioners. The aftermath of the burning was also part of the ritual. The ashes and remains might be scattered, buried, or left in place as a grim reminder of the punishment. Some communities believed that the destruction of the body prevented the witch's spirit from returning to haunt or harm the living, adding a supernatural element to the execution. The public burning was more than a simple execution. It was a social event, a spectacle imbued with religious, legal, and cultural significance. It reinforced the fears and beliefs of the time, ensuring that the community witnessed the consequences of stepping outside accepted boundaries. For the accused, it was a terrifying and brutal end, a final chapter in a story marked by suspicion, fear, and cruelty. Despite the horror of the scene, public executions were attended with a strange mix of solemnity and fascination. They were moments when the entire village seemed to pause, united by shared belief and fear, watching as one of their own was consumed by flames. The echoes of those fiery deaths lingered in local memory, shaping folklore, cautionary tales, and the collective psyche for generations to come. The burning of accused witches was a stark manifestation of the era's superstitions and the tragic consequences of mass hysteria. It reflected a society grappling with fear and uncertainty, searching for scapegoats to explain misfortune and miseries that no one fully understood. In the end, the public execution by burning was both a punishment and a performance, an act designed to satisfy the demands of justice as defined by the fearful, superstitious, and often ruthless communities of the 1600s. After the flames died down and the last embers of the execution smoldered in the cold earth, the village was left with a heavy silence. The ordeal of burning a witch was never truly over for the community. It marked a profound rupture in daily life, an event that etched itself deep into the collective memory and emotions of those who had witnessed or participated in it. Though the physical act of punishment was complete, the social and psychological aftermath lingered long after the crowd had dispersed. In some ways, the village tried to return to normalcy. Daily routines resumed, the markets opened, children went to school or helped with chores, farmers tended to their fields, and families gathered in their homes. On the surface, life appeared to go back to the familiar rhythms of small community existence. Yet beneath this veneer, the fabric of trust and connection had been frayed or even torn. The accused had once been part of the community, neighbors, friends, or distant relatives, and now their absence was a stark reminder of fear's power. The immediate aftermath was often marked by an uneasy quiet. Conversations that might have once been commonplace, about the weather, the harvest, or local news, became subdued, as if people were afraid that speaking too openly might invite another wave of suspicion. The shadow of the witch hunt hung over the village like a fog, dulling the brightness of everyday life. People averted their eyes, whispered behind closed doors, and sometimes outright refused to discuss what had happened, either out of guilt or self-preservation. Guilt was a heavy burden for many. Those who had testified against the accused, who had joined in the accusations or cheered at the execution, sometimes wrestled with remorse. The knowledge that they might have contributed to the death of an innocent, or even a barely understood outcast, gnawed at their conscience. This remorse was rarely voiced openly, for fear of social stigma or retribution, but it haunted the quiet moments at home and the restless nights. The family and close friends of the accused were often left shattered and isolated. They bore the social consequences of the witchcraft accusation, even if they had no part in the events themselves. Their homes might be shunned, their livelihoods disrupted, and their reputations stained. In some cases, the stigma lasted for generations, with descendants living under a cloud of suspicion simply because of their ancestors' fate. Fear persisted long after the flames were extinguished. The witch hunts were born out of fear, and fear was not so easily conquered. Villagers remained wary, suspicious of strangers or anyone who behaved differently. The idea that evil could lurk in their midst did not disappear with one execution. It evolved into a lingering tension, an unspoken wariness that colored relationships and social interactions. For some, the execution reinforced a sense of safety and moral order. They believed that by eliminating the witch, the community had cleansed itself of evil, and that peace would return. However, this belief was fragile and often temporary. Misfortunes, failed crops, illness, or harsh weather were soon blamed on new scapegoats, reigniting the cycle of accusation and fear. In some villages, the aftermath saw a gradual unraveling of social cohesion. People who had once cooperated now distrusted each other. Old grudges resurfaced, and new conflicts emerged, fueled by the paranoia that the witch hunt had unleashed. This atmosphere could lead to more accusations, further trials, and sometimes entire families or groups being targeted in a spiraling wave of hysteria. Silence was another defining feature of the aftermath. The trauma was too great for many to articulate, and speaking openly about what had happened could be dangerous or socially unacceptable. Stories of the accused which became hushed legends, passed down in whispers, warnings, or even outright denials. This silence preserved the memory of the event but also distorted it, as details were forgotten or changed with each retelling. The psychological scars were not limited to individuals. Entire villages bore the weight of what had transpired. Children who witnessed the events might grow up with a deep-seated fear or resentment. Elders remembered the executions with a mixture of pride and shame. The collective memory was complex, a tangled web of horror, relief, and uncertainty. In some places, the aftermath included efforts to heal or make amends. Decades or centuries later, communities sometimes issued apologies, erected memorials, or sought to understand the tragic mistakes of their past. Yet for those who lived through the witch hunts, such gestures were often too late to ease the immediate pain and disruption. The social and spiritual fabric of the village was deeply affected. Churches might have preached about repentance and forgiveness, urging the community to move forward. Yet the fear of witchcraft and evil spirits persisted, woven into sermons and folklore, shaping the worldview of generations to come. Even after the accused were gone, their presence lingered in the village's stories, superstitions, and fears. The place where the burning took place could become a site of unease, a haunted space avoided by locals. Ghost stories and legends about the witch's spirits seeking revenge or protection were common, blending historical reality with myth. In some, the aftermath of a witch burning was not a neat ending but a complex and often painful process. The village's return to normal was marred by silence, fear, guilt, and the slow work of emotional and social recovery. For many, the memory of the accused, and the events leading to their death, remained a dark shadow, a reminder of the dangers of fear unchecked by reason or compassion. The witch hunts of the 1600s were not random acts born out of mere superstition alone. They were deeply rooted in complex social, psychological, and political factors that combined to create a perfect storm of fear and suspicion. At the heart of these accusations was fear of the unknown, fear of chaos, and fear of forces beyond human control. People living in these tightly knit, superstitious communities often found themselves vulnerable to inexplicable misfortunes such as sudden illnesses, failed crops, or natural disasters. In times of uncertainty, it was a natural but tragic human impulse to seek explanations and to identify someone to blame. The witch, as an easily identifiable scapegoat, became the focus of this collective anxiety. Ignorance played a significant role in fostering and sustaining these fears. The 1600s were a time before modern science or medicine had taken root. Knowledge about disease, natural phenomena, and human behavior was rudimentary at best. Without a scientific framework to understand illness or bad weather, people relied heavily on superstition and religious doctrine. The Church's teachings often linked misfortune to divine punishment or evil forces, creating fertile ground for belief in witches as agents of the devil. This lack of understanding made the supernatural an attractive explanation for the hardships that plagued daily life. Power dynamics were another crucial element that shaped the witch hunts. In many villages, accusations were not merely about finding the truth but were entangled with social struggles for power, influence, and control. Accusing someone of witchcraft could be a way for individuals or families to settle old scores, eliminate rivals, or seize property. It was a tool of social control wielded by those in authority, including religious leaders, local magistrates, and sometimes even neighbors. In some cases, those who accused witches gained status or rewards, which created incentives to continue the hunt. Projecting fears onto others was a psychological mechanism that enabled communities to externalize their anxieties. When faced with the unpredictability of life, plagues, famine, political upheaval, villagers needed a tangible enemy to channel their collective unease. Witches, often portrayed as agents of evil, were cast as the embodiment of everything that threatened the community's safety and moral order. This projection simplified the complex realities of human suffering into a narrative of good versus evil, allowing people to feel a sense of control by rooting out the threat. Religious fervor amplified these fears and accusations. The 1600s were a time of intense religious conflict and reformations, where the boundaries between orthodox belief and heresy were sharply enforced. The Church often promoted the idea that the devil was active in the world, seeking to corrupt souls through witchcraft. This religious context meant that accusations were not just about social or personal grievances but were framed as spiritual battles. People genuinely believed they were fighting a cosmic war between God and Satan, which justified extreme measures against those accused. Economic instability also fueled witch hunts. In many villages, harsh economic conditions, poor harvests, famine, and poverty exacerbated tensions among neighbors. In such an environment, suspicion and resentment could quickly escalate into accusations. Widows or single women who owned land or resources might be targeted because their independence challenged traditional patriarchal norms, and accusing them of witchcraft was a means to reclaim control over property or social standing. Gender played a fundamental role in these dynamics. Women were disproportionately accused of witchcraft, not merely because of superstition, but because of entrenched gender roles that saw independent, outspoken, or knowledgeable women as threats. Those who practiced healing, midwifery, or herbalism, roles traditionally occupied by women, were especially vulnerable, as their knowledge was both respected and feared. These women existed on the margins of societal norms, and accusations served to reinforce the rigid gender expectations of the time. The role of mass hysteria cannot be overlooked. Fear, once sparked, spread rapidly through small communities like wildfire. One accusation could set off a chain reaction, with panic feeding on itself. People's imaginations, fueled by anxiety and rumor, could transform a minor grievance into a community-wide crisis. This hysteria made it difficult for reason or skepticism to prevail, as collective fear overwhelmed individual judgment. Legal structures and the justice system of the time were also complicit in enabling accusations. The lack of fair trials and reliance on dubious evidence created an environment where mere suspicion could lead to conviction. Courts often accepted hearsay, spectral evidence, or confessions extracted under torture as legitimate proof. This systemic failure allowed accusations to flourish without proper safeguards. Religious and political authorities sometimes used witch hunts to consolidate power or distract from other social problems. By focusing public attention on a supposed internal enemy, leaders could divert unrest away from themselves. This manipulation of public fear served political ends, making witch hunts a tool for control beyond just community safety. Social isolation and alienation also contributed to why accusations happened. Those who lived on the fringes of society, outsiders, the poor, the elderly, or those with unusual behavior, were easy targets because their difference marked them as suspicious. In communities where conformity was vital for survival, any deviation could invite deadly consequences. The human need for scapegoats in times of crisis is a recurring theme throughout history, and the witch hunts were no exception. When disasters struck, people found it easier to blame an individual than to confront complex systemic issues such as disease, economic hardship, or political instability. This mechanism allowed people to avoid facing uncomfortable truths by projecting blame outward. In conclusion, the accusations of witchcraft in the 1600s were the result of a toxic mix of fear, ignorance, power struggles, religious zeal, and social dynamics. People projected their fears onto vulnerable individuals who represented everything that was different or threatening to the fragile order of village life. These accusations were not merely the product of superstition but reflected deep psychological and societal mechanisms that turned neighbors against each other in a tragic search for meaning and control. In the 1600s, gender roles were rigidly defined by deeply ingrained societal and religious beliefs. Women were expected to embody obedience, modesty, and subservience within a male-dominated society. These expectations confined them largely to the domestic sphere, raising children, managing the household, and supporting their husbands. Any woman who stepped outside these narrowly prescribed roles risked suspicion and social backlash. It is in this context that women became disproportionately targeted in witch hunts, as deviations from gender norms were often seen as dangerous or unnatural. Women who lived independently, such as widows who inherited property or women who remained unmarried, were especially vulnerable to accusations. In a time when women's social and economic power was limited by their relationship to men, independence could be seen as threatening. A widow who managed her own affairs without male oversight might be viewed with distrust, particularly if her neighbors were struggling or envied her position. The idea that such women could be practicing witchcraft was a convenient way to explain away their difference and assert social control. Another group of women often accused were those who possessed specialized knowledge: healers, midwives, and herbalists. These women played critical roles in their communities, especially in rural areas where access to formal medical care was scarce. They used herbs, folk remedies, and practical experience to treat illnesses, assist with childbirth, and offer comfort. However, their knowledge was double-edged. While it brought healing, it also aroused suspicion. To many, the ability to influence health and life through mysterious means blurred the line between healing and sorcery. The connection of women's healing practices to magic and the supernatural made them easy targets when fear and panic took hold. Midwives, in particular, occupied a complicated position. They were responsible not only for delivering babies but also for ensuring the health of mother and child. Childbirth was a dangerous and often fatal event, and when things went wrong, midwives could be blamed. If a baby died or a mother suffered complications, it was sometimes interpreted as the work of witchcraft. Moreover, midwives' knowledge of anatomy and herbs was viewed with suspicion by male doctors and religious authorities, who sometimes accused them of consorting with the devil. Women who were outspoken, assertive, or who challenged male authority were also more likely to be labeled witches. The patriarchal society of the 1600s did not tolerate women who defied norms or spoke their minds. Such women were seen as disrupting the social order, and accusations of witchcraft became a weapon to silence or punish them. In many cases, what was perceived as witch-like behavior was simply women acting with agency in a restrictive society. Physical appearance could also be a factor. Women who were older, poor, or physically different, scarred, disabled, or otherwise marked, were more vulnerable to suspicion. The stereotype of the witch as an old, ugly crone was not merely a myth but reflected the reality that marginalized women bore the brunt of accusations. Their perceived otherness set them apart from the community and made them easy targets for blame. The role of women in society was closely tied to religious teachings that emphasized their inherent moral weakness and susceptibility to temptation. This belief justified the idea that women were more likely to fall under the influence of the devil and engage in witchcraft. Sermons and religious tracts often depicted women as the weaker vessel, prone to sin and evil. Such teachings reinforced gender biases and made accusations of witchcraft against women more credible in the eyes of the community. In many cases, accusations were driven by jealousy or resentment toward women who did not fit the mold. Women who owned property, or were successful in business, could inspire envy and hostility. The label of witch was a way to undermine their status and reduce their influence. Similarly, women who had conflicts with neighbors, engaged in disputes over land, or otherwise stood out socially were at higher risk of being accused. The disproportionate targeting of women also reflects broader power structures that sought to maintain male dominance. Witch hunts served as a form of social control, policing women's behavior and enforcing conformity. By branding independent or non-conforming women as witches, society reinforced the idea that women's place was subordinate and obedient. It is also important to note that while the majority of those accused were women, men were not entirely exempt. Men who defied social norms, engaged in healing practices, or were socially isolated could also be accused. However, the overwhelming majority, estimates suggest around 75–85%, were women, highlighting the gendered nature of the witch hunts. This gender imbalance also played into the imagery and narrative surrounding witches. Cultural depictions often emphasized female witchcraft as seductive, dangerous, and subversive. Witches were portrayed as women who had made pacts with the devil, using their charm and cunning to manipulate others. These narratives reinforced fears of female power as something threatening and unnatural. Women accused of witchcraft often faced not only legal and physical persecution but also profound social isolation. Their reputations were ruined, and their families could suffer long after accusations were made. Being branded a witch meant exclusion from community life, loss of support networks, and sometimes abandonment by loved ones. The stigma was heavy and enduring. The knowledge that women's traditional roles as healers or caregivers could be twisted into accusations of evil highlights the fragile position women held in 1600 society. Their survival often depended on navigating a precarious balance between usefulness and suspicion. The witch hunts brutally exposed how women's power, whether real or perceived, was feared and punished. In summary, the disproportionate accusation of women as witches was deeply connected to the rigid gender roles of the time, societal fears, and power structures. Women who were independent, knowledgeable, or who challenged social norms were at particular risk. The witch hunts functioned as a way to police and punish women who stepped outside the narrowly defined boundaries of their expected roles, revealing a dark intersection of fear, misogyny, and control. In the tense atmosphere of the 1600s witch hunts, silence often spoke louder than words. The small villages and tight-knit communities where these accusations arose were places where everyone knew each other, and the social fabric was delicate and fragile. When someone was accused of witchcraft, it wasn't just the accused who suffered. The entire community was gripped by fear. This fear was powerful enough to keep many neighbors, friends, and family members silent, even when they might have known the accused were innocent or wished to defend them. Speaking out publicly against accusations was incredibly risky and could easily backfire, putting the accuser themselves in danger. In these superstitious communities, the idea of witchcraft was terrifying. It wasn't just a crime against the law, it was seen as a crime against God and the natural order. To be associated with witches, even by defending someone accused, was to invite suspicion and jeopardize your own safety and reputation. This created a culture of self-preservation where people were more likely to stay quiet than risk becoming the next target. When a neighbor was accused, many people instinctively distanced themselves. They stopped visiting, offering help, or speaking openly. This wasn't always out of cruelty, it was often a survival tactic. No one wanted to be branded a sympathizer or an accomplice to witchcraft. Given the harsh punishments and social stigma attached to witches, being connected to an accused person could result in suspicion falling on you too. Even close family members sometimes hesitated to speak out. While some may have tried to protect their loved ones, the intense pressure of the witch trials often made this impossible. Families lived in fear that their defense could turn the entire household into a target. Some relatives might have felt powerless against the overwhelming forces of the law and public opinion, while others might have been swayed by the same fears and superstitions gripping the whole village. Neighbors, friends, and witnesses frequently recounted vague, second-hand suspicions or hearsay to avoid direct involvement. They might have whispered rumors behind closed doors but refused to appear in court or openly challenge the accusations. The courtroom itself was an intimidating place, and testifying could easily be twisted or turned against someone. The atmosphere was one of paranoia and mistrust. People watched each other closely, wary of even innocent behaviors being misinterpreted. A casual glance, a misunderstood comment, or an accidental brush against another person's property could be remembered and used as evidence. In such an environment, silence was often the safest option. Some witnesses deliberately chose not to reveal information that might have helped the accused. For example, if someone knew that a particular event had a natural explanation or that an accusation was based on jealousy, they might still stay quiet to avoid stirring trouble. In this way, the community's collective silence helped fuel the hysteria rather than stop it. Religious authorities and witch hunters also played a role in promoting silence. They often demanded confessions and testimony but discouraged people from openly challenging the process. The power imbalance made it dangerous to question the court's authority or the validity of the accusations. People learned quickly that speaking out could mean being accused of obstructing justice or even witchcraft themselves. Some individuals who did try to defend the accused found themselves ostracized or accused later on. This created a chilling effect, warning others that supporting someone labeled a witch was hazardous. Fear spread quickly, and soon entire communities were trapped in a cycle of accusation and silence. In some cases, Bystanders may have been torn between their conscience and their fear. They might have privately doubted the accusations but felt helpless or too scared to intervene. This internal conflict added to the emotional and psychological burden carried by many during the witch hunts. Social hierarchies also influenced who stayed silent and why. Lower status villagers often feared speaking out against more powerful neighbors or authorities. The pressure to conform and avoid conflict with those in power meant many remained quiet even when they suspected injustice. The impact of this widespread silence was devastating. It isolated the accused even further, leaving them without support or allies. It reinforced the idea that the accused were truly dangerous and separate from the community, even if that was far from the truth. In many ways, the silence of bystanders was a form of complicity, whether intentional or not. It allowed the machinery of the witch hunts to keep turning, feeding the hysteria and enabling the continuation of accusations and executions. This silence wasn't just passive, it shaped the entire dynamic of the witch trials. Without vocal support or resistance, the accusations gained legitimacy. The lack of opposition made it easier for courts to convict and for the public to accept harsh punishments. At the same time, the fear-induced silence created lasting scars in communities. Trust broke down, friendships ended, and neighbors became strangers. The communal bonds that had once held villages together were torn apart by suspicion and unspoken fears. In some historical cases, after the hysteria subsided, communities would reflect on the silence that had allowed so much suffering to occur. Some individuals admitted regret for not speaking up sooner. However, these admissions came too late to help those who had already been executed or ruined. The culture of fear and silence highlights how powerful social pressures were in controlling behavior. It shows how ordinary people, caught in extraordinary circumstances, chose self-preservation over confrontation, even at great moral cost. In summary, the silence of bystanders during the witch hunts was a complex and tragic phenomenon driven by fear, social pressure, and self-interest. It contributed to the spread and persistence of accusations and left deep wounds in communities that endured long after the trials ended. Being accused of witchcraft in the 1600s carried devastating social consequences that extended far beyond the courtroom and the grim prospect of execution. Even for those who somehow escaped the fatal sentence, the label of witch was a mark that could condemn a person to a lifetime of isolation, fear, and hardship. In these small, tightly woven communities, reputation was everything. To be branded a witch was to be cast out from the social fabric, denied basic trust and support, and pushed to the very margins of society. Once accused, a person's neighbors often treated them as a pariah. Friends would avoid contact, families would pull their children away, and neighbors who once exchanged pleasantries would refuse even to meet their gaze. This social exile was not just emotional but could have deadly practical effects. The accused often found themselves cut off from the exchange of goods and favors that were essential for survival in these impoverished communities. In villages where life was hard and resources scarce, losing social standing could mean losing access to help during illness, food during lean times, or shelter in harsh weather. Starvation was a real threat for accused witches who remained alive. Many were shunned so thoroughly that no one would sell or give them food, nor would they be allowed to work for wages or barter for goods. The social boycott was a silent form of punishment that could slowly wear down even the strongest individuals. Some accused witches died not from execution but from neglect and starvation imposed by their fearful or angry neighbors. Fear was a constant companion for those labeled witches. Even if they escaped physical punishment, the psychological toll was immense. The accused lived under a cloud of suspicion, often with neighbors watching their every move, waiting for any slip that might confirm their guilt. This fear could erode mental health and lead to profound loneliness. Many spent their days in isolation, cut off from community life and burdened by the stigma that followed them everywhere. Marriage prospects and family relationships were also destroyed by a witchcraft accusation. Women who were accused often found themselves divorced or abandoned by husbands, if they were married at all. Families might disown accused members to avoid being tainted by association. Children of accused witches were sometimes shunned or mistreated by others, growing up under a shadow that could affect their entire lives. For widows or single women, already vulnerable in this patriarchal society, the accusation of witchcraft could be especially harsh. Without a husband or family to protect them, they were easy targets for suspicion and had few resources to defend themselves. Their social isolation before the accusation only worsened afterward, deepening their marginalization. Even the accused who were acquitted often faced ongoing suspicion. The court's ruling did not erase the stigma. Rumors and whispered accusations could continue for years, making it impossible for them to return to normal life. Some found it safer to leave their homes and communities entirely, becoming wandering outcasts with no real place to belong. The social consequences of being branded a witch extended to economic ruin as well. Accused individuals lost their land, property, or belongings either through confiscation by authorities or because neighbors refused to do business with them. This economic deprivation was often compounded by the legal costs of defending themselves or paying fines, plunging them deeper into poverty. Religious exclusion was another harsh reality. Being labeled a witch was synonymous with being damned or in league with the devil. Many churches refused to allow accused witches to participate in sacraments or attend services. This spiritual isolation added another layer of suffering, as religion was central to daily life and community cohesion. In some cases, entire families or households were implicated by association, spreading the social consequences beyond the accused individual. Relatives might lose status, suffer economic hardship, or be watched suspiciously, all because of their connection to someone labeled a witch. The psychological scars of social exile were often lifelong. Many accused witches lived with the trauma of rejection and fear, and the memory of being cast out could haunt them until their deaths. Even after the witch hunts ended, communities often continued to carry the weight of those divisions and the memories of injustice. Communities themselves suffered from the social fragmentation caused by witchcraft accusations. Fear and suspicion undermined trust and cooperation, making it difficult to rebuild social bonds. Some villages never fully recovered the sense of unity they had before the accusations began. The social consequences also extended to children and descendants of the accused. Stigma could be passed down through generations, affecting marriage prospects, economic opportunities, and social acceptance. The legacy of being related to a witch was a burden that lingered long after the trials ended. Some accused individuals tried to rebuild their lives through public displays of piety or service to the community, hoping to erase the stain of suspicion. Others withdrew completely, living quiet, hidden lives to avoid further persecution. The constant fear of renewed accusations or vigilante violence kept many accused witches in a state of heightened anxiety. Even death did not always bring peace, as families sometimes faced harassment or confiscation of property after their loved ones were gone. Overall, the social consequences of being accused of witchcraft were brutal and far-reaching. The accusation alone, regardless of legal outcome, was a sentence to a life of fear, poverty, loneliness, and exclusion. These consequences reveal how deeply intertwined social standing, reputation, and survival were in early modern communities and how devastating it could be to lose one's place within them. In the dark and fearful era of the 1600s, witch hunters and professional accusers played a pivotal and chilling role in fueling the witch hunts that swept across Europe and the American colonies. These individuals often traveled from village to village, carrying with them a reputation for ferocity and determination in rooting out supposed witches. They presented themselves as defenders of faith and order, claiming a divine mission to protect communities from the hidden evils of witchcraft. However, beneath some of this outward piety, there often lurked more complicated motives: greed, ambition, and the allure of power. Many professional witch hunters genuinely believed they were performing a sacred duty. In deeply religious societies dominated by a strict interpretation of Christianity, the fight against witchcraft was seen as a holy crusade. These men, and occasionally women, convinced themselves that they were protecting innocent souls from the devil's influence and safeguarding the moral fabric of society. They wielded their authority with conviction, bolstered by the widespread fear that witches could bring illness, crop failures, and disaster. To them, the work was not only just but necessary, a way to cleanse the community and please God. However, the figure of the witch hunter was often more complex. Many were itinerant professionals who relied on the witch trials for their livelihood. They would travel from town to town, offering their services for a fee paid by local authorities or concerned citizens. This created a disturbing incentive structure. The more witches they discovered, the more work they would generate, and the more money they could earn. This dynamic led some witch hunters to exaggerate evidence, pressure confessions, or even fabricate accusations to justify their continued presence and payment. These professional accusers often arrived armed with an array of tools and methods designed to identify witches. They might bring with them special witch-finding instruments, guides on how to interrogate suspects, and advice on how to conduct trials. Their expertise was feared and respected, but it also meant that accusations were more likely to spiral into deadly outcomes. Their presence escalated tensions in villages already fraught with suspicion and fear, turning small disputes or unexplained misfortunes into matters of life and death. Some witch hunters were granted official roles or titles by local governments or religious authorities, giving them significant power in deciding who would be accused, interrogated, and ultimately executed. Their authority was rarely questioned, especially by frightened communities eager for swift action against perceived threats. This institutional backing gave their accusations a veneer of legitimacy, even when their methods were brutal or dubious. The psychological impact of their visits was immense. When a witch hunter arrived, the atmosphere in the village shifted. Ordinary disagreements or minor grievances could suddenly escalate into dangerous accusations. The presence of a professional accuser was often enough to ignite hysteria, as people scrambled to prove their innocence or accuse rivals out of fear. Witch hunters could quickly turn neighbors against one another, disrupting social cohesion and trust. The witch hunters' interrogation tactics were notorious for being harsh and unforgiving. They often employed relentless questioning, aimed not just at uncovering supposed witchcraft but at extracting confessions by any means necessary. Physical torture was sometimes used, sanctioned, or overlooked by authorities eager for swift convictions. The stress of these interrogations, combined with fear of execution, caused many accused to confess to impossible acts, further feeding the frenzy. Financial motivations were a dark undercurrent in many witch-hunting campaigns. Some witch hunters amassed wealth and influence by controlling the flow of accusations and trials. They could manipulate accusations to target wealthy or vulnerable individuals, sometimes settling personal vendettas under the guise of spiritual justice. Payments for their services, as well as gifts or bribes from desperate families, could enrich these professionals, who were often outsiders to the communities they terrorized. In some cases, witch hunters also served political agendas. Local rulers or religious leaders used them to consolidate power or suppress dissent. By directing witch hunts against unpopular groups or individuals, authorities could eliminate rivals or reinforce social hierarchies. The witch hunters thus became tools in broader struggles for control, not just agents of moral or spiritual cleansing. Public perception of witch hunters varied. In some places, they were hailed as heroes and protectors, receiving community support and gratitude. In others, their presence was met with suspicion or fear, especially if they were known to be harsh or corrupt. However, few could escape the stigma of causing great suffering, even if some believed their actions were justified. Some witch hunters kept detailed records of their activities, which historians today use to understand the scale and nature of witch trials. These records reveal patterns of accusation, interrogation methods, and outcomes. However, they also expose the biases and motivations behind the hunts, showing how personal gain and prejudice often intertwined with religious fervor. The professionalization of witch hunting contributed to the tragic efficiency of the witch trials. With specialized individuals dedicated solely to uncovering witches, accusations spread faster, trials were conducted more swiftly, and executions increased. This institutionalization transformed what might have been sporadic and localized suspicions into systematic campaigns of persecution. Despite their often terrifying influence, the role of witch hunters eventually came under criticism and decline as the witch hunts waned in the late 1600s and early 1700s. Enlightenment ideas, growing skepticism about witchcraft, and legal reforms reduced the power of these accusers. Some former witch hunters faced disgrace, while others disappeared into obscurity. In reflecting on their legacy, it becomes clear how the combination of religious zeal, fear, and human ambition created an environment ripe for exploitation. Witch hunters were both a symptom and a cause of the hysteria that consumed communities, turning neighbor against neighbor in a deadly dance of suspicion and accusation. This dark chapter in history is a sobering reminder of how fear and power can combine to produce devastating consequences, especially when individuals exploit communal anxieties for personal gain. The stories of witch hunters illustrate the dangers of unchecked authority and the human cost of paranoia masquerading as righteousness. Mass hysteria and group accusations were terrifying and defining features of the witch hunts in the 1600s, transforming isolated suspicions into widespread panic that engulfed entire communities. Once a single accusation was made, it often set off a chain reaction, rapidly spiraling beyond control and sweeping up dozens, sometimes even hundreds, of people. The contagious nature of fear and suspicion was a powerful force, breaking down social bonds and turning neighbors, friends, and family members against one another. It often began with a small incident, a sudden illness, a failed harvest, or an unfortunate death, that people struggled to explain. In an age when science was rudimentary and superstition reigned, such events were frequently attributed to the work of witches. If one person was accused of causing harm through dark magic, others would quickly come under suspicion as well, especially those who were already marginalized or distrusted in the community. The fear that there must be more than one which became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Communities became gripped by a deep, collective anxiety that no one could escape. This atmosphere of dread created a feedback loop. The more accusations flew, the more terrified people became, and the more they felt compelled to name others as witches to protect themselves. In such a climate, even the smallest gesture or word could be twisted into evidence of guilt. Rumors spread like wildfire, fueled by whispered conversations, gossip, and the public spectacle of trials and executions. The social fabric began to unravel as hysteria deepened. Friends would turn on friends, siblings on siblings, and parents on children. Accusations could arise from petty grievances, jealousy, or old grudges, weaponized by the pervasive fear of witchcraft. This escalation often led to neighbor betraying neighbor just to avoid becoming the next target. People started to isolate themselves, wary of any interaction that might draw suspicion. In many cases, the hysteria was fueled by children and young people, whose testimonies or accusations became central to the witch trials. Children might accuse relatives or neighbors after being coerced or encouraged by adults or authorities, amplifying the panic. Their vivid, emotional accounts were often taken seriously despite their questionable reliability, adding fuel to the fire of mass accusations. Once accusations multiplied, they gained legitimacy in the eyes of the authorities and the general public. Courts and officials, pressured to act, felt compelled to arrest and try multiple suspects at once. This led to mass trials, where dozens of accused witches faced grim proceedings together, their fates often sealed before the trial began. The sheer scale of the accusations overwhelmed communities, further deepening the sense of chaos and fear. Public gatherings for trials and executions became enormous events, reinforcing the hysteria. As crowds watched the punishment of accused witches, their fear and paranoia were magnified. The spectacle served as a warning but also as a release valve for collective anxieties, making the fear tangible and shared. This communal experience, rather than calming tensions, often intensified the panic, encouraging more accusations. Sometimes, the mass hysteria was triggered or worsened by external crises. War, famine, disease outbreaks, or economic hardships heightened stress and insecurity, making people more likely to look for scapegoats. Witchcraft accusations provided a way to explain misfortune in a world full of uncertainty, creating a dangerous outlet for communal frustration. The psychological impact of living through such mass hysteria was profound. Entire communities lived in fear not just of witches, but of being accused themselves. This pervasive dread altered everyday life, from how people spoke and acted to who they trusted and avoided. Social norms were upended, as the priority became survival and self-preservation rather than cooperation or kindness. Historians describe this phenomenon as a fear spiral, where initial suspicion gave rise to increasing paranoia, which in turn generated more accusations, fueling an endless loop. The cycle was difficult to break because the consequences of stepping out of line could be deadly. Silence or denial was not an option, as failing to report suspected witches might itself be seen as complicity. The spiral of accusations also reflected deep societal fractures between classes, genders, and families. Those already marginalized, poor women, widows, the elderly, or social outcasts, were most vulnerable. The hysteria provided a means to enforce social control and reinforce existing power structures by targeting those who deviated from accepted norms. In some infamous cases, Entire villages or regions became engulfed in witchcraft panic, with hundreds accused and dozens executed in a short span of time. The scale of the tragedy was immense, leaving scars that lasted generations. Survivors often struggled with guilt, trauma, and social upheaval long after the hysteria subsided. The contagious nature of mass hysteria also meant that witch hunts sometimes spread geographically, leaping from one village or town to the next. News of accusations and trials traveled quickly, inspiring fear and imitation elsewhere. This created waves of witch hunts across regions and countries, fueled by a mix of superstition, religious zeal, and social anxiety. Understanding how mass hysteria functioned during the witch hunts reveals how vulnerable human communities can be to fear-driven collective behavior. It shows how easily rationality and justice can be overwhelmed when panic takes hold. The witch hunts stand as a grim example of what happens when fear replaces compassion and reason. Despite the terrifying scale of the hysteria, there were occasional voices of reason and skepticism. Some community members, clergy, or officials questioned the validity of accusations and called for caution. Unfortunately, such voices were often drowned out by the overwhelming tide of fear, and those who spoke up risked becoming targets themselves. The legacy of mass hysteria during the witch hunts serves as a cautionary tale. It reminds us of the importance of critical thinking, due process, and protecting the vulnerable from mob justice. It also highlights how societal stress and fear can distort reality and lead to tragic outcomes if not addressed with empathy and reason. This phenomenon of group accusations and panic is not just a relic of the past. Similar patterns can be observed in modern times whenever communities face crises and seek scapegoats. Studying the witch hunts helps us understand and hopefully prevent the repetition of such destructive cycles in any era. In sum, mass hysteria turned the witch hunts into something far more than isolated tragedies. It created a sweeping social disaster fueled by fear, suspicion, and collective panic. One accusation could indeed unleash a wave of terror, destroying countless lives and communities before the frenzy finally subsided. False confessions were a tragic and all too common outcome of the witch trials in the 1600s, often serving as the twisted proof that authorities sought to confirm their suspicions. The terrifying ordeal faced by those accused of witchcraft created an environment where confessing, even to things that were impossible or absurd, became a desperate survival tactic. People confessed not because they were guilty of the dark deeds they described, but because the pressure to admit guilt was overwhelming, and often the only way to escape unbearable pain or a prolonged death. The confessions extracted during witch trials were frequently the result of extreme duress. Interrogations could last for hours, even days, without breaks for sleep or rest. The accused were subjected to psychological torment, being mocked, threatened, isolated, or made to believe that their souls were doomed. The mental strain alone was enough to break many people's resolve, pushing them toward false admissions. The constant fear of torture, or the reality of it, made confession seem like the only option to lessen suffering. Physical torture was a common tool to force confessions. Although not all trials used torture, when it was employed, it was devastatingly effective. Methods included sleep deprivation, whipping, binding the accused in painful positions, or using devices designed to inflict maximum pain without killing outright. The knowledge that further torture could come at any moment created a psychological climate of terror. Faced with this, many accused individuals confessed to anything their interrogators suggested, hoping it would end the agony. Often, the content of these confessions was bizarre or impossible by any rational measure. People confessed to flying on broomsticks, meeting with the devil, attending witches' sabbaths, or causing storms and plagues through magical means. Some admitted to making pacts with Satan, renouncing their faith, or harming neighbors with curses. These fantastical stories were shaped by the expectations and leading questions of the interrogators, who wanted to confirm the existence of witchcraft and justify their actions. The confessions were sometimes scripted or coached by the authorities. In many cases, accused witches were told exactly what to say to demonstrate their guilt. This coercion meant that confessions lost any claim to truth, instead becoming theatrical performances designed to satisfy the demands of the inquisitors. The accused, terrified and worn down, had little choice but to comply. False confessions also arose from the accused trying to protect others. Sometimes, under pressure, a person would name neighbors, friends, or family members as fellow witches, either because they hoped this would curry favor with the authorities or simply to stop the interrogation. This dynamic further spread the witch hunts, creating a vicious cycle where one forced confession led to more accusations and arrests. The psychological burden on those who confessed was immense. Many lived in fear of the consequences of their words, realizing that confessing did not guarantee mercy but often sealed their fate. Yet the hope that cooperation might lead to leniency was a powerful motivator. Some accused individuals clung to the belief that confession was a way to save their souls or gain a less painful death, even as they spoke of impossible crimes they had never committed. In some cases, confessions were extracted from people who were mentally or physically vulnerable. Elderly women, those with mental illness, or individuals weakened by poor prison conditions were especially prone to breaking under interrogation. Their confessions were often unreliable, shaped by confusion, fear, or misunderstanding. Yet these admissions were treated as definitive evidence. It is important to understand that the very nature of these false confessions was shaped by the cultural and religious context of the time. The idea that witches made pacts with the devil or engaged in occult rituals was deeply ingrained in society's imagination. This framework shaped the kinds of confessions that were considered credible, meaning that people were often forced to confess to activities that matched prevailing myths rather than their own realities. Many confessions were detailed and graphic, describing ceremonies, magical acts, and the names of other supposed witches. These narratives reinforced the authorities' worldview and fed the public's fear. They also created an illusion of truthfulness, as if the accused were willingly admitting to terrible deeds rather than suffering under coercion. The impact of false confessions extended far beyond the individuals who uttered them. They served to legitimize the entire witch-hunting apparatus, convincing judges, clergy, and the public that witchcraft was real and dangerous. This validation perpetuated the cycle of accusations, arrests, and executions, causing more innocent people to be drawn into the nightmare. Many historians today view these confessions as tragic artifacts of a brutal system, illustrating how fear and power can manipulate people into betraying themselves. They highlight the catastrophic failure of justice when due process and evidence-based inquiry are abandoned in favor of hysteria and intimidation. False confessions also reveal the profound human suffering beneath the surface of the witch trials. Behind every fantastical story of devil's pacts and sorcery was a person in agony, trapped in a cruel system that crushed their dignity and humanity. The desperation to confess, no matter how false, was a testament to the unbearable reality faced by the accused. In retrospect, the confessions are a stark reminder of the dangers of coercion and the importance of protecting the rights of the accused. They warn against accepting any statement made under threat or torture as truthful, a lesson that echoes into modern legal and human rights standards. Even after the witch hunts ended, the legacy of false confessions persisted. They became part of folklore and cautionary tales, shaping how future generations understood the dark history of witch persecution. The stories of impossible crimes and terrible deeds continued to haunt the collective memory, often overshadowing the real pain and injustice experienced by the victims. The false confessions also complicate historical understanding. They blur the line between fact and fiction, making it challenging for historians to untangle truth from myth. However, by recognizing the conditions under which these confessions were made, scholars can better interpret the events and honor the victims' suffering. In conclusion, false confessions were a tragic byproduct of the intense fear, torture, and social pressure that defined the witch hunts of the 1600s. They were not admissions of guilt, but desperate acts of survival, shaped by an unforgiving system bent on proving its own beliefs. These confessions fed the hysteria, justified cruel punishments, and left a haunting legacy of injustice that still resonates today. Even long after the fires had died down and the echoes of public executions faded from the village squares, the stories of those accused witches lingered like shadows cast by flickering candlelight. These tales did not vanish with the deaths of the accused. Instead, they transformed into oral stories, legends, and cautionary narratives that traveled from generation to generation, becoming an enduring part of the cultural fabric in many communities. The figure of the witch became more than a historical victim. She evolved into a symbol, a ghostly presence, a warning whispered to children, and a mysterious character in the collective imagination. In small villages, where life was tightly woven by shared experiences and oral tradition, storytelling was one of the primary ways information, history, and social norms were passed down. After a witch trial, Neighbors and townsfolk would recount tales of the accused in hushed tones, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes mournful, but always with a mixture of fascination and fear. These stories often portrayed the witch as someone who had dealings with dark forces, who could curse crops, cause sickness, or haunt the living with malevolent spirits. The accused became larger-than-life figures, both feared and pitied, their stories blurring the line between fact and folklore. One common form these stories took was the ghost story. It was said that the spirit of the witch, wronged and restless, would roam the outskirts of the village, appearing near the places where she had once lived or been executed. These spectral tales were terrifying to the villagers and served to keep the memory of the witch alive, even if they cast her in a fearsome light. Ghostly apparitions, mysterious noises at night, or sudden chills in the air were often attributed to her restless spirit. In some versions, the witch's ghost was a harbinger of bad luck or disaster, reinforcing the lingering fear connected to her name. Alongside ghost stories, cautionary tales became a popular genre. Parents warned children not to wander into the woods alone lest they be caught by the witch, or not to speak rudely to strangers or old women who might be witches in disguise. These tales were used as social tools to enforce rules and maintain order in the community, linking bad behavior or misfortune to the power of witchcraft. The stories were designed to teach lessons about obedience, respect, and fear of the supernatural. They embedded the witch's image deep into the psyche of the village, a constant reminder of the consequences of straying from accepted norms. The stories also sometimes contained elements of tragedy and injustice. In quieter moments, villagers might tell tales that hinted at the witch's suffering or innocence. These were stories of misunderstood women, lonely and ostracized, whose only crime was not fitting into the rigid social expectations. Such versions created a more nuanced memory, a mix of sorrow and regret beneath the fear. These narratives helped humanize the accused, even if they were told in whispers and only to select audiences. In some regions, the memory of witches became entwined with superstition about certain places. Rocks, trees, or abandoned houses were said to be cursed or haunted by the witch's presence. These sites became part of local lore, visited with a mix of dread and curiosity. Pilgrimages to these places sometimes occurred during festivals or special nights when people believed the veil between worlds was thinnest. The witch's legacy transformed the landscape itself, making geography a keeper of memory. The witch stories also shaped the community's identity. Villagers might say, "That's the witch's well," or "Don't go near the witch's forest," phrases that kept the past alive in everyday language. These references served as reminders of the trauma the community had experienced, embedding a collective history that was both a warning and a scar. Over time, these names and stories became so ingrained that few questioned their origins. In some cases, the legends took on elements of empowerment or rebellion. In certain folk traditions, the figure of the witch evolved from a feared outcast into a symbol of resistance against oppression, especially in later centuries. Tales emerged that celebrated the witch's knowledge of herbs, healing, and nature, casting her as a wise woman wronged by fearful authorities. These reinterpretations challenged the old narratives and allowed communities to reclaim parts of their history in a new light. The oral stories about witches also served as a coping mechanism for communities dealing with the trauma of the hunts. By turning painful history into stories, people could process their fear and guilt in a way that made it manageable. Storytelling allowed communities to make sense of events that were confusing and terrifying, weaving them into the broader tapestry of human experience. Another important aspect of these stories was how they preserved details about the accused. Names, personalities, and even specific events related to the witch trials were passed down, albeit often distorted or romanticized. For historians today, these oral traditions can be valuable clues, even though they must be critically examined, as they capture emotions and perspectives absent from official records. The stories also acted as warnings to future generations. They reminded villagers to be wary of outsiders, of those who were different, or of behavior that might attract suspicion. The caution embedded in these tales often reflected the same fears that had led to the witch hunts originally, perpetuating cycles of mistrust and fear. In many places, these oral legends eventually found their way into written forms: folk songs, ballads, poems, and later books that preserved the stories for wider audiences. This transition from spoken word to written text helped cement the witch's image in cultural memory, influencing art, literature, and popular culture long after the original trials. Over time, the stories surrounding witches grew into myths that were sometimes completely detached from historical reality. The witch became a character in fairy tales and fantasy, both villain and misunderstood outcast. These myths often lost sight of the real human suffering involved but kept alive the fascination with witchcraft and the supernatural. Despite the passage of centuries, the echoes of those dark days remain audible in these stories. The legends remind us of how fear and misunderstanding can destroy lives, and how communities, even in their darkest moments, try to find meaning through storytelling. They serve as a cultural mirror reflecting humanity's complex relationship with fear, power, and difference. The persistence of these stories also underscores the importance of memory and history. They challenge us to remember not just the sensational images of witches and magic, but the real people who suffered because of ignorance and prejudice. Oral stories bridge the gap between past and present, ensuring that the lessons of history are not forgotten. In conclusion, the stories and legends that remained after the witch trials were far more than mere entertainment or superstition. They were powerful vessels carrying the pain, fear, guilt, and sometimes hope of entire communities. As folklore, ghost tales, and cautionary legends, they shaped cultural identity and social norms, leaving an indelible mark on the collective memory of the villages that witnessed the horrors of witch hunts. To be accused of witchcraft in the 1600s was not only to face the terrifying prospect of trial and death, but also to endure a profound social isolation that was, in many ways, a slow, living death long before any execution took place. During the accusation period, the accused found themselves cast out, not just physically but emotionally and socially, from the community they had been part of their entire lives. This isolation was one of the cruelest punishments, often beginning immediately after the first whisper of suspicion spread. Imagine waking each day to the cold reality that your neighbors, once familiar and friendly, now turned their backs. People you might have exchanged greetings with on the village street now averted their eyes or crossed to the other side to avoid you. It was as if a silent barrier had been erected, a wall of fear and suspicion so thick it muffled all human connection. This deliberate avoidance sent a clear message: you were no longer one of them. You were marked, branded by invisible yet palpable social stigma. In many cases, friends and even family members abandoned the accused, terrified that association might taint their own reputations or place them under suspicion. It was common for relatives to cut ties or refuse to visit, leaving the accused utterly alone in the world. The emotional devastation of such abandonment was profound. Human beings relied deeply on social bonds for support and survival, and losing that support was a slow erosion of the accused's spirit. Without community support, practical survival became a daily challenge. The accused often found themselves denied basic assistance. Neighbors refused to lend food, share water, or provide firewood during harsh winters. If they were poor to begin with, this social cutoff could quickly lead to starvation or exposure to the elements. In small villages where cooperation was essential for survival, being isolated meant facing hunger and hardship alone. Moreover, this isolation was not just external but internalized. Many accused women and men felt the crushing weight of loneliness and despair. The fear of what was to come, the uncertainty of their fate, and the knowledge that no one would stand beside them created a suffocating mental state. Anxiety and depression were common companions in these dark times, though no one spoke of such things openly. Silence was a weapon wielded by the community. People refused to speak to the accused, and if conversation did occur, it was laced with suspicion or thinly veiled accusations. The accused might overhear whispers when passing by, sharp glances exchanged between neighbors, or cold, judgmental stares. This unspoken condemnation often felt more painful than direct confrontation. The accused lived under a constant, oppressive spotlight of scrutiny. The social isolation was also reinforced by the church and local leaders. Often, sermons would condemn witchcraft in harsh terms, reminding the congregation of the devil's work and the need to purge evil from the community. This religious rhetoric validated the ostracism and gave it a divine justification. The accused were not only outcasts but sinners, enemies of God, which intensified the community's rejection. Children, too, were taught to avoid the accused. In villages, where children played and learned social behaviors through imitation, the rejection was swift and complete. The children of the accused were often shunned, bullied, or even driven from the village, a further extension of the punishment. This breakdown of family and social networks created ripples of suffering that extended beyond the individual accused. The isolation extended to practical matters of daily life. Accused witches were frequently barred from attending communal events such as church services, markets, or festivals. They were effectively erased from public life, forced into a shadow existence on the margins of society. This physical exclusion deepened the emotional wounds and heightened their vulnerability. In some instances, accused individuals were literally locked away or confined to their homes before formal imprisonment, further cutting off their contact with the world. Neighbors might watch their windows nervously, keeping an eye on the accused as if they were dangerous beasts. The accused lived under constant surveillance, stripped of privacy and dignity. The psychological torment of isolation often led to desperate acts. Some accused tried to appeal to neighbors or clergy for mercy, but more often than not, their pleas were ignored or met with suspicion. Without allies, their words fell on deaf ears, and their voices were lost in a community that had turned its back on them. This silence was often reinforced by fear. Speaking out in defense of an accused which was dangerous, as it could invite suspicion upon oneself. Friends and relatives might want to help but chose silence to protect their own lives and reputations. This culture of fear and silence created an echo chamber that fueled further accusations and deepened the accused's alienation. The isolation experienced during the accusation period was a form of social death. Even as the accused remained physically alive, they were effectively cut off from the social world that gave life meaning. This liminal existence was psychologically torturous and often devastating, stripping away hope and leaving only fear and despair. In many cases, this isolation paved the way for further abuse during imprisonment and trial. The accused's social ostracism made it easier for authorities to justify harsh treatment and dismiss any claims of innocence. The community's rejection became a self-fulfilling prophecy, sealing the accused's fate long before the final sentence. The profound loneliness and fear experienced during this period created an atmosphere of helplessness. Many accused women were left to face their ordeal completely alone, with no one to advocate for them or offer comfort. The emotional wounds inflicted during this time were often deeper and more enduring than the physical ones they might later endure. Social isolation also reinforced the accused's vulnerability to coercion. Without a support network, the accused were easier to break under interrogation and pressure to confess. The absence of allies left them exposed to psychological manipulation and torture without any buffer or protection. The experience of social isolation during the witchcraft accusation period was one of the most insidious aspects of the entire ordeal. It destroyed families, communities, and individual lives in a slow, creeping way that was as cruel as the trials themselves. The silence and rejection surrounded the accused like a suffocating fog, making survival seem impossible even before the court's final judgment. In this way, the isolation was both a symptom and a tool of the witch hunts. It reflected the deep fears and prejudices of the community, while also facilitating the machinery of accusation and punishment. To be cut off from one's community was to be cast into a shadowy realm where humanity was denied, and the horrors of the witch trials could unfold unchallenged. While the burning of accused witches has become the most notorious image associated with witch trials, it was not the only method of execution or punishment during the witch hunts of the 1600s. In fact, the specific form of punishment often depended heavily on local laws, cultural norms, and religious influences. Some places embraced fire as a symbol of spiritual purification, while others saw hanging, pressing, or even imprisonment as more appropriate. Each method carried its own ritualistic weight, psychological terror, and lasting scars on the community. In many parts of England and its colonies, hanging was the more common punishment for those found guilty of witchcraft. Unlike burning, hanging was considered a lawful civilian execution and was often conducted on public gallows just outside the town's boundaries. Accused witches would be escorted in chains through the streets, with villagers lining the path, some shouting, others weeping, and many watching in tense silence. The gallows, with its grim silhouette against the sky, served as a symbol of law and order, but it also became a stage for fear and spectacle. Hanging was often quick, though not always clean. If the drop was too short, the accused could strangle slowly, their legs twitching, their face turning purple, while the crowd bore witness. In Scotland, parts of Germany, and areas deeply influenced by Catholic doctrine, burning at the stake was more prevalent. Fire was seen as a way to cleanse the soul and purge evil from the flesh. But even within these regions, the process wasn't always the same. In some towns, the accused were strangled before the flames were lit, a small act of mercy. In others, no such leniency was offered. The suffering of the condemned was fully visible to the crowd, which was sometimes encouraged to see it as a necessary lesson or divine justice. For many who watched, the smell of burning flesh and the screams of the accused left permanent impressions. Another horrifying method used in certain places, particularly in England, was pressing, also known as peine forte et dure. This punishment was reserved for those who refused to enter a plea, guilty or not guilty, before the court. Refusing to plead was often an act of desperation, as it sometimes protected a person's property from being seized by the state after a guilty verdict. But the price was heavy. The accused would be laid on the ground with a wooden board placed over their body. Gradually, heavy stones or weights were added, crushing the chest, forcing the air out of the lungs, and breaking bones. The process could take hours or even days, with the person begging for mercy or gasping final prayers beneath the crushing weight. It was a method designed not only to punish but to force submission. Some victims finally entered a plea just to escape the pain, others died in silence. Imprisonment itself was also used as a form of punishment, especially in cases where the evidence was weak but the suspicion remained. An accused which might not be executed but instead locked away indefinitely. These prison sentences could last for years, and the conditions were horrendous: cold, damp cells, poor sanitation, and barely any food or water. Many died from illness, starvation, or despair before a trial ever occurred. In some instances, imprisonment was a kind of social limbo, a way for the town to rid itself of a troubling individual without confronting the full weight of execution. But for the accused, it was a life lived in shadow, often forgotten and suffering in silence. Public humiliation was another punishment that sometimes preceded or replaced execution. The accused might be placed in the stocks, a wooden frame that held their arms and head in place while the townspeople mocked, spit, or threw rotten food. Others were paraded through the village in shackles, forced to confess their sins. The goal was clear: to shame, isolate, and weaken them before a final judgment. In deeply religious communities, spiritual punishment also played a role: excommunication from the church, denial of burial rites, or being declared eternally damned. These forms of punishment cut deep into the soul of the accused and those who loved them. In some rare cases, banishment was used as a lesser punishment. An accused individual might be cast out of the village, forced to leave behind their home, family, and identity. This was both a physical and social death, as the person would often wander from town to town, carrying the stigma of witchcraft like a scarlet letter. No one would offer shelter. No one would trust them. The label followed them like a curse. It was, in many ways, a prolonged suffering that never ended. Children, too, could be punished, especially if they were accused alongside their mothers. While execution of children was less common, it did occur, particularly in places like Würzburg and Bamberg in Germany during the peak of witch hysteria. In some cases, children were coerced into confessing or were used as witnesses against adults. Others were imprisoned or left to starve after their families were executed. The trauma inflicted on these young lives was immeasurable, and the communities that allowed it were often driven by fear rather than logic or compassion. Some punishments were symbolic but emotionally devastating. A woman might be shaved bald, an act of public shaming, or have her belongings burned in front of her. A man might be forced to stand in front of the congregation and declare himself a servant of the devil before being exiled. These actions weren't about justice, they were about control. They reminded everyone watching that stepping outside the bounds of social norms, gender roles, or religious expectations could bring ruin. In regions governed by inquisitorial courts, such as in parts of Spain or Italy, the punishment could involve long trials under the Inquisition, which sometimes led to forced penance rather than death. Those found guilty might be forced to wear a special garment, called a sanbenito, for life, marking them as heretics. Their names could be inscribed in public records or carved into church walls as a warning. Though they lived, they were never truly free again. In cases where the accused were executed but later found to have been innocent, or when the hysteria died down, some communities held posthumous trials or issued pardons. But the damage was done. Graves were left unmarked or defiled. families remained disgraced. These late acknowledgements could not undo the agony of execution or the lifelong pain of surviving relatives. Every form of punishment, from the subtle to the savage, served a larger purpose. It reinforced the power of religious and civic authorities. It maintained a social order built on fear. And it reminded everyone that survival required obedience, conformity, and silence. The execution or punishment of an accused which was never just about the individual. It was a performance for the community, a cautionary tale etched into collective memory. Even today, echoes of these punishments linger. They live in folklore, ghost stories, and historical records. They survive as reminders of what fear and ignorance can justify in the name of morality. And they ask us to remember the names and the pain of those who suffered, so that such horrors are never allowed to return in any form. Some of the only traces left behind by the accused were the small, silent objects they once held in their hands. A shawl folded carefully on a wooden chair. A pair of worn shoes placed near the hearth. A simple comb or a wooden spoon. These were ordinary items, but after an accusation, they began to carry a different kind of weight. The moment someone was taken away, accused of witchcraft, hauled out by guards or neighbors, their belongings suddenly became pieces of evidence, or worse, objects to be feared. Even the most harmless things could take on a dark shape in the mind of a frightened village. A cracked teacup on a shelf might be whispered about as a tool used in potion making. A leather-bound book on herbs and remedies, once used to ease childbirth or soothe fevers, could become a damning clue. People would poke through the home of the accused, afraid and curious, looking for signs. If they found dried plants hanging from the ceiling, old bones in a kitchen bowl, or small figures carved from wood, they'd point and say, "See? Proof." These were often ordinary items used in healing or daily life, but in the tense air of suspicion, they became symbols of danger. Everyday tools became cursed relics in the minds of people desperate for explanations. Sometimes, the accused themselves left marks behind. Scratched names in stone walls of prison cells. Little prayers carved into wood with fingernails or bits of broken pottery. A simple cross. A child's name. A plea for mercy or forgiveness. These markings were quiet and often hidden in places where no one might look, behind beams, beneath cots, inside drawers. These small carvings were last attempts at speaking, at being remembered, or simply holding on to sanity. They were not dramatic or elaborate. They were human. A heart. A star. A set of initials. Tiny things that said, "I was here." In rare cases, a letter might survive. Some of the accused, especially those who were literate, wrote down their final thoughts, confessions, or defenses. These were usually scribbled on scraps of paper, tucked away in cracks in walls or handed to a sympathetic guard. Most of them never made it past the cell doors, but a few did. They were read by family members in secret or smuggled to others in nearby villages. These notes were full of heartbreak, pleas to care for children, words of love to spouses, or attempts to clear a name. Some were angry, others were calm, but all carried the voice of someone silenced too soon. Books were another kind of object that could survive, though not always safely. Midwives and herbalists often kept handwritten collections of remedies, observations about plants, and notes on healing. These weren't magic books, they were simple guides to help treat illness, stop bleeding, or bring comfort during childbirth. But during a witch trial, such a book could become deeply dangerous. Townspeople might point to it as a spell book. If it had symbols or foreign words, it was even worse. Most of these books were burned along with the accused, but a few were hidden by family or passed down quietly. In some cases, they became sacred family items, wrapped in cloth and buried under floorboards, never to be touched again. There were also small religious items left behind, rosary beads, crosses, worn Bibles. Some of the accused clung to their faith until the very end, even when the church itself turned against them. They would press these items into the hands of loved ones as they were taken away, or leave them at the foot of their beds. These objects became both comfort and curse. Some families treasured them as proof of innocence. Others feared them, wondering if the stain of accusation might linger. Superstition made it hard to tell the difference. Clothing was sometimes left hanging on hooks or folded at the edge of a bed. A scarf with familiar stitching. A bonnet worn every Sunday. items that once held the smell and warmth of someone now gone. These things were often quietly disposed of, burned in the hearth, buried in the woods, or passed to wandering traders. People didn't want reminders, but they also didn't want to touch them. The fear was too thick. Touching the belongings of an accused which could be seen as a kind of contamination, as if guilt or darkness could be transferred like dust on a sleeve. Sometimes, even animals were left behind, a cat with nowhere to go, a goat standing alone in a pen. These creatures, once beloved companions or useful workers, were now seen through a different lens. A black cat might be thought of as a familiar. A hen that laid strange eggs could be treated with suspicion. Some animals were driven off or killed outright. Others simply wandered, waiting at doors that no longer opened, until hunger or kindness took them away. There were houses, too, that remained untouched for weeks or months. Homes of the accused were often avoided, left to rot. Doors hung open. Roofs leaked. Wind moved through rooms that had once been filled with laughter or quiet work. Children who lived there were sometimes sent away or hidden by distant relatives. If no one returned to claim the home, it would fall into disrepair, and eventually the village might tear it down. But long before that happened, it became a place to whisper about. That's where she lived, they'd say, without speaking her name. Some villagers, in secret, kept small keepsakes. A lock of hair, a piece of cloth, a favorite spoon. These were hidden not because they were believed to be magical, but because they belonged to someone loved, a mother, sister, friend. Keeping such things was dangerous, and so they were hidden in walls, tucked into books, or wrapped in cloth at the back of a drawer. They became quiet memorials, a way to say, she mattered. She was real. In a few places, chalk marks or strange symbols appeared on homes after an accusation. Sometimes these were made by authorities, a way of labeling who had been taken. Other times, neighbors drew protective signs to keep bad luck away. These marks often stayed long after the person was gone, reminders that something had happened there. Even when scrubbed away, people remembered where they had been. And in the minds of those who lived through it, the real objects were not always physical. They were memories. The sound of boots on the path. The sudden silence of a house. The sight of a friend being pulled away. Those things stayed long after the belongings had been burned, buried, or forgotten. They lingered in stories and glances, passed quietly from generation to generation, not always spoken, but never truly gone. In the quiet years that followed the peak of the witch trials, long after the fires had gone out and the accused were buried or forgotten, some people began to speak, not in courtrooms, but in whispers, in letters, in prayers spoken in the dark. There were those who had once pointed fingers or pounded gavels who later found themselves haunted by what they had done. These were not public outbursts of regret, not at first. At first, they were personal reckonings. A witness who had lied. A neighbor who had stayed silent. A judge who had passed sentence and tried not to look the accused in the eye. Time, it seemed, didn't erase what had happened. It only made the guilt harder to ignore. There were confessions made to priests or ministers, some of which were recorded in church books or personal journals. A man might come forward, grey-haired and hollow-eyed, and admit that the woman he'd testified against had only ever been kind to him. That he had said what he said because he was afraid, or jealous, or angry. A midwife might admit to shaking with guilt every time she walked past the home of someone she'd helped send to the gallows. These weren't acts of bravery. They were acts of quiet desperation. By the time remorse came, the damage had already been done, and the people they might have saved were long dead. Judges, too, were not immune. Some of them had been young and eager, thinking they were doing God's work. They'd been swept up in the panic, in the certainty that evil walked among them. But years later, when the panic faded and the world seemed quieter, they found themselves asking terrible questions. What if they had been wrong? What if that old woman's tears had been honest? What if that child's accusations had been fed to them by frightened parents? Some judges wrote apologies in legal documents, renouncing the trials they had overseen. Others resigned from public life and disappeared into obscurity, unable to bear the weight of what they had done. In some towns, the church itself issued statements of regret. Ministers who had preached sermons about evil and purity began to reconsider what they had taught their flocks. They stood at pulpits and tried to untangle the fear from the faith, admitting, in roundabout ways, that perhaps too many had died. Perhaps none should have died. These apologies were often vague, softened by time and the fear of admitting full responsibility. But they were still apologies. And in a time when reputation and pride meant everything, even that was something. But for the families of the accused, these late apologies were cold comfort. A daughter couldn't be returned. A mother couldn't be unburned. A reputation couldn't be made whole again after it had been destroyed by rumor and fear. Some families moved away, unable to bear the weight of the village's stares. Others stayed, quietly tending graves with no names. They listened to the apologies, when they came, with tight mouths and heavy hearts. Some forgave. Many did not. There were letters written by remorseful accusers, sent to children or grandchildren of the people they'd helped condemn. These letters were often full of grief, confusion, and attempts to explain the unexplainable. They wrote of sleepless nights, of seeing the faces of the accused in dreams. They spoke of fear, not just of witches, but of being wrong. Of being swept up in something larger than themselves and not having the strength to resist it. They tried to apologize across decades, across generations. But paper and ink could only go so far. Sometimes it wasn't just people who apologized, but entire towns. Decades or even centuries later, communities held memorials or issued formal declarations, naming the victims and acknowledging the injustice. In some cases, these acts were sparked by historians or descendants who refused to let the past stay buried. A statue might be raised. A plaque might be placed near the site of a former gallows. Words like innocent and wrongfully accused would finally be said aloud. These acts couldn't bring peace to those who had suffered, but they did serve as a kind of reckoning, an attempt to speak the truth, even if it came far too late. And yet, there were still those who never spoke. Some people buried their guilt so deep they carried it to their graves. Others convinced themselves they had done the right thing, or had no choice. And some, perhaps the most tormented of all, lived between those two beliefs, never quite able to justify their actions, never quite able to fully own them. Their silence was its own kind of apology, heavy and unresolved. It's worth noting that not all remorse was pure. Some of it was born from fear of divine punishment, not sorrow for the victims. A judge might confess only because he feared damnation. A witness might apologize because they feared being accused next. These apologies were tangled with self-preservation, and it's impossible to separate the sincerity from the fear. But even so, they were signs that the terror had cracked, that the fog of hysteria had started to lift. The deepest apologies, though, often came from within. Not written down, not spoken aloud, but lived quietly every day. A woman who never again raised her voice in anger, because she remembered what happened the last time she spoke out. A man who avoided the town square, unable to look anyone in the eye. People who lived with the echo of screams and the memory of flames. They carried their remorse like a shadow, present in every quiet moment, in every long night. And then there were the children, those who had watched mothers or aunts dragged away, who had grown up hearing whispers about their families. For them, the apologies were sometimes the first and only validation they ever received. To hear someone say, "Your mother was innocent," was both a balm and a fresh wound. It couldn't change what had happened, but it could shift how they saw the world. It could remind them that what had happened wasn't right, and that, perhaps, they weren't alone. This video is for educational or entertainment purposes only, and information provided in the video may be incorrect. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing to the channel and like the video. Good night.